Bran Stark sat in his wheeled chair at the heart of the Red Keep's Godswood, branches swaying overhead in a listless breeze. It was a rare thing to find a quiet place in King's Landing, even rarer within the walls of the Red Keep itself. But the old weirwood had always possessed a calming presence that soothed those who sought its shade. Sunlight trickled down between the leaves, illuminating his pale face and the distant, milky sheen of his eyes. Though he appeared young, a boy still by some reckonings, he was far older in spirit than any living soul. He had peered through the eyes of ravens soaring above the wall, walked in memories older than legends, and witnessed uncountable joys and cruelties that Westeros had suffered and inflicted. And in those quiet hours, as the breeze played with the locks of his dark brown hair, a momentous decision crystallized in his mind, harder than Valyrian steel and just as unyielding. He had come to King's Landing after the wars that ravaged Westeros. He had been declared king by a reluctant and battered assembly of lords, a compromise to end the cycle of bloodshed and ambition. Yet being king was less a dream than a burden, an existence under the weight of centuries of grudges and alliances, betrayals and oaths. He had not wanted it, but he had accepted it. And so King Bran the Broken had done his best to steer Westeros toward peace. He listened patiently to counsels, weighed their advice with compassion, and allowed his gift, the power of the three-eyed raven, to guide him when mortal judgment faltered. But as the months passed, a gnawing fear took root in him. The old patterns were stirring again. Whispers of discontent in the north, rumors of opportunistic lords in the Reach, glimmers of restlessness in Dorne. The Targaryen name had faded, true, but the thirst for power that had consumed the Targaryens, and the Baratheons and the Lannisters and all the others who had come before, was not so easily extinguished. Bran had tried reconciliation. He had tried forging treaties and alliances built on reason rather than fear, on unity rather than conquest. His small council did what they could, always pragmatic Tyrion Lannister at his side, perpetually exhausted by the magnitude of the realm's rebuilding. Ser Davos Seaworth, a man of straightforward wisdom, had traveled the coasts to ensure trade resumed and starving smallfolk were fed. Brienne of Tarth performed her duties with unwavering honor, keeping the king's guard vigilant, ensuring that no tyrant might rise under her watch. Yet there were always quiet tensions in the corners. Idle hands, idle hearts, men whose warlike natures could not be content with peace for too long. In the Godswood, where the heart tree's crimson leaves trembled in the faint breeze, Bran allowed himself to slip deeper into the green sight. On the surface, he appeared half lost in reverie, but inside he was traveling. He soared across Westeros, gliding on the wings of crows and ravens, seeing beyond the mountains, across the seas. He felt the swirling tides of memory, ages' worth of knowledge stored in the old roots and the ancient wood. He saw the beginnings of House Stark, the forging of the Seven Kingdoms, the doom of Valyria, and everything else that had shaped and scarred the realm. He saw how each memory was a tether. Families clung to old grudges, ancient wounds refused to mend. Bran understood that these memories chained Westeros to an endless cycle, dooming it to repeat the same mistakes. No matter how good the intentions, no matter how strong the moral convictions, the realm always reverted to power struggles and the thirst for dominion. When he emerged from his trance, dawn light was streaking the sky. The decision was there, carved out in the silence of the night. He would sever these chains. He would do the unthinkable. He would wipe away the accumulated memories that kept Westeros locked in a tragic loop. It was not something he took lightly, and even as he felt the resolution settle over him, sorrow stabbed at his heart. Memory was identity, and to take it away from an entire continent was a sin that might rival the greatest horrors ever committed. But he believed it was a sin that might also bring redemption, a final reset for a realm that had only known violence. If there was to be lasting peace, the burdens of old alliances and vendettas must vanish like mist under the rising sun. He told no one at first. He feared Tyrion would argue against it, railing about free will and how essential knowledge of the past was to avoid repeating it. Sansa, in Winterfell, might see it as a betrayal of the North's identity, of the very pride that had sustained them through the harshest winters. Arya, wandering unknown seas, might not care to return. But if she did, she would resent losing the memories that shaped her. Yet Bran recognized that if Westeros were to be truly free of the past, the cost must be paid by everyone, himself included, though he suspected his gifts would shield him. He was the three-eyed raven, after all, the living repository of the world's memory. If he chose to shape the fate of the realm, none but he could unshape it again. The means to accomplish such a feat did not lie solely within him. The weirwoods, ancient and pulsing with the life of countless generations, provided a conduit for him to reach the minds of those who prayed beneath their branches, those who carried a piece of the old gods within their hearts even if they never set foot near a heart tree. Over centuries, the old gods and their trees had become connected to the people of Westeros. Though the faith of the Seven was more prominent in the south, the bones of the land were still laced with the old magic. Every field, every mountain pass, every stretch of farmland and forest had once belonged to the children of the forest, had once been woven into the living tapestry of the weirwoods. The North, especially, was a living testament to that power. If Bran harnessed it, if he extended his reach through the entire network of roots and trunks and silent faces carved in white bark, he could touch every mind in Westeros. He wondered if that would be enough, if the strongholds of the faith of the Seven, if the drowned men of the Iron Islands, if the red priests of R'hllor in the distant corners would remain immune. But the weirwoods were ancient, older than the faith, older than the drowned god, older than the red god's flames. They had watched the first men cross the land bridge, had listened to the pledges of the kings of winter, and had endured the Undulls and their steel. They had endured everything, and so, too, would their magic. If Bran could tap into that primal force, it would sweep across the entire continent like an invisible wind, binding every mortal mind to his purpose. They would forget the pains and hatreds that shaped them. They would still be themselves, with the same hearts and personalities, but unburdened by the knowledge of who they had been and whom they had despised. He tested this theory in small ways. A nightly journey into the mind of a guard who walked past the godswood. He slipped into the man's dreams for just an instant, brushed aside a memory of a petty argument from earlier in the day. The next morning, the guard barely recognized that any wrongdoing or slight had occurred, his anger replaced by a mild sense of confusion. It was a small victory, a sign that the path was open. Yet the scale of what Bran intended was vast, thousands upon thousands of souls across the Seven Kingdoms. More than the Seven Kingdoms, even. It might reach the wildlings beyond the wall, the last enclaves in the far west, maybe even the edges of Essos if the weirwood seeds took root there. And if the world forgot, what shape would it take next? Bran breathed a soft sigh the morning he committed to the ritual in full. The Red Keep was just beginning to stir. Servants scurried about, preparing for the day's tasks. City guards marched down cobblestone streets. Far in the distance, blacksmiths hammered out the metal that would become new swords and plows. The sound of crows cawing overhead joined the chorus of the city. Bran could sense their sharp eyes. Each crow, each raven, beckoned to him like an extension of his own awareness. He could look through them whenever he wished, though he now needed no such vantage. He had all of Westeros in his mind. He glanced down at his withered legs. A pang of bitterness threatened to surface. Memories of the day he was pushed from that tower window in Winterfell. But with practiced ease, he let that bitterness drain away. He was beyond such sentiments now, or so he told himself. He turned the wheels of his chair, moving himself closer to the weirwood trunk. He pressed his palm against the carved face in the white bark, cool to the touch, silent as a statue, but he could feel it pulsing with hidden life. He had spent hours here, hidden from the courts and the throne. Some thought him a strange king, prone to long silences and abrupt pronouncements. They were right, but those who came to truly know him, Tyrion, Brienne, Davos, understood that Bran's silence was neither apathy nor aloofness. It was the stillness of a deep lake, reflecting the entire sky. He closed his eyes and slipped beneath the surface of that lake. The world of green dreams rose around him, swirling. The face of the weirwood loomed large, ancient as time itself. He let the roots of its consciousness spread into him, or rather, he spread into them. The faces of other weirwoods across Westeros glowed in his mind, like distant lanterns in the dark. One by one, he touched them, felt their presence, felt them open to him. North, east, south, west, they answered. Beneath each face was soil soaked with countless years of prayers and confessions, love and fear. Within that soil lay the bones of the children of the forest, the first men, the animals of the wood, lives folded into the land's collective memory. Bran felt no fear, only a sense of wonder at the vast tapestry he was about to unravel. He began the ritual slowly, focusing first on King's Landing. There were more weirwoods than most knew, small hidden godswoods in noble manors, private shrines and altars. Even a sapling grown in a pot by a devout northerner could suffice for a conduit. Through each living piece of weirwood, he reached out, his consciousness threading through the labyrinth of mortal minds. He sensed the swirl of their memories, everything from petty squabbles to the horrors of war. He felt the heartbreak of mothers who had lost sons, the rage of men who had lost pride, the cunning schemes of ambitious courtiers. It was a cacophony of thought. For a moment, Bran reeled at the immensity, nearly overcome by the sheer chaos of it all. Then he reminded himself of his place, the calm center in a raging storm. He was the three-eyed raven. Steeling his resolve, he gently tugged at their memories, unraveling them like threads from a woven tapestry. Not to destroy them entirely. He was not certain he could or should, but to wrap them in a soft, white oblivion. He gave them all the gift of forgetting. Would it be a gift, truly, or a curse? He supposed time would make that judgment. One by one, he touched the minds in King's Landing. Bakers, gold cloaks, peddlers, blacksmiths, prostitutes, and knights. They would carry on breathing, living, but the context of their lives would vanish like morning dew. They would awaken in confusion, uncertain of where they were or why. Some might retain bits of knowledge, like how to tie a knot or how to swing a sword. Muscle memory and basic crafts were more a matter of skill than of conscious recollection. But the names, the loyalties, the hatreds, the illusions of grandeur or the depth of personal regrets, those would fade. He could feel the wave spreading outward, across the city. In his mind's eye, he saw men drop the tasks in their hands as their minds reeled. A gold cloak on patrol paused mid-step, weapon lowered, a frown of bewilderment growing on his face. A woman washing laundry in the muddy waters behind Flea Bottom paused, her hands ceasing their automatic ringing. A highborn lady in her chamber, carefully selecting jewelry for the day's court, felt her mind drift until she no longer recognized the silver comb in her hand or the face in her mirror. Silently, gently, Bran reached further, beyond the walls into the outlying farms and towns. He followed the roads that led north, south, and west. He moved like a phantom across the crownlands, guided by ravens that perched in stunted trees, guided by the roots of weirwoods that grew in hidden groves. The realm was open to him, and he glided through it like an invisible wind. Perhaps an hour passed, or perhaps a day. Time became meaningless in the green dream. He was everywhere at once, moving in an ever-widening circle, plucking away the burdens of memory. Castle Rosby, Duskendale, Maidenpool, Harrenhal, Riverrun, all fell under his silent wave. He felt flickers of resistance from some minds, individuals whose will was strong or whose ties to the land were tenuous. Priests of the Red God, their beliefs ablaze in their hearts, seemed to catch a moment of alarm, as if sensing a great power. A few of the devout overcame them with prayers, but in the end, the land's ancient magic was older and far more patient than the flames. Their memories, too, faded. In the Riverlands, near the banks of the Trident, men who had once died and been resurrected by the Lord of Light might have stirred in uneasy dreams. But now their line was mostly ended, and the few that remained were no match for the slow inevitability of the weirwoods. Eastward, across the sea, the effect would weaken, for the weirwoods' presence was far less established there. But that was not Bran's concern right now. He felt the ravenous swirl of memory burn out in the Stormlands, as the lords of those lands forgot both their lineage and their many generational feuds. Northwards, It swept past the neck, up the King's Road, until even the stony plains around Winterfell bowed to his will. Finally, he let the wave of forgetfulness roll across the cold expanses beyond the wall. The free folk, once united by Jon Snow, would forget Mance Rayder, forget the battles they fought. The siblings of the Night's Watch stationed at the few remaining castles would pause in their lonely vigil, uncertain why they were even there. It was a moment both terrifying and, in a way, merciful. One kingdom, one land, united in a single act of oblivion. No more vendettas between the Umbers and the Karstarks, or the Lannisters and the Martells or the Tyrells, who were nearly wiped out anyway, and their old rivals. Wiped clean, all of them. Bran could sense the hush that settled over Westeros, the collective moment of confusion, as though the entire continent had gasped at once and forgotten to exhale. His vision returned to the Godswood in King's Landing, and for a moment, he could only hear the pounding of his own heart. Everything was still. The weirwood's carved face stared at him blankly, as though uncertain what had just happened. Bran found himself alone in the hush of the dawn, the city around him unmoored. He breathed slowly, feeling the weight of what he had done. The realm had changed in a single morning, irreversibly perhaps. He could sense that his own mind was largely untouched, a vantage that would allow him to guide the realm forward, if that was even possible. His station as king remained recognized by the formal documents, by the physical seat he occupied, by his place in the Red Keep. But who would heed a king if they did not remember the concept of monarchy? He trembled with the aftershock of the magic. Then, steeling himself, Bran peered ahead, letting go of the weirwood's bark. His breath was uneven. All about him he could hear the crows cawing. He sensed the mindlessness in the city, and for the first time, fear gripped him. Had he destroyed their ability to function entirely? Had he robbed them of reason and turned them into husks? The swirl of the Green Dream had given him the sense that they would retain basic capacities: speech, physical skills, emotional instincts. But would they know how to speak if they had lost memory of what language was, or to whom they spoke it? Basic knowledge, he had theorized, might remain. After all, memory was layered. There were reflexes, instincts, muscle memory, words one learned so young that they barely qualified as recollections. But everything tied to identity, to place, to hatred, love, loyalty, that was gone. He had to see for himself. He turned his chair around with arms that still grew tired from the effort. He made his way down the paths of the Godswood, leaves drifting around his wheels. At the edge of the yard, a young guard stood. The man stared at Bran with blank confusion. His hand still clutched a spear, but he did not move to bar the king's path. He only stared at Bran as though uncertain what the contraption of the wheeled chair even meant. He blinked. Bran studied him, offering a soft greeting. The man's eyes darted in sudden alarm, as if he recognized the sound but couldn't place it. He parted his lips, fumbling for words he no longer possessed. Then something like habit took over, and he tried to speak, though his speech came out clumsy and hesitant. Still, the guard managed a reply, though not in a proper sentence. More a stutter of half-remembered sounds that might once have been "Your Grace," but now were only confusion. The rest of King's Landing was no different. People stumbled in the streets, heads turning left and right, searching for any hint of familiarity. Mothers held crying children who did not recognize the arms that held them. Merchants gazed at their wares in silent perplexity. Others stared at the gold and silver of their coins, unsure why these pieces of metal mattered. In the corridors of the Red Keep, half-dressed servants wandered, uncertain why they carried trays of food or pitchers of water. The rush of daily life, the choreographed dance of a city that had seen countless generations come and go, had ground to a halt. Yet it was not total chaos. No one remembered fear in the sense of war or rebellion. Their confusion was raw, immediate, and childlike. Bran found Tyrion Lannister in a corridor near the throne room. The hand of the king had apparently been on his way to an early meeting with the Master of Coin, though that knowledge was lost to him now. Tyrion leaned against a window, peering at the city as though it were a puzzle. Bran approached silently, watching the little man's expression. Tyrion's face was contorted by puzzlement, his mismatched eyes flicking from one shape to another. He rubbed at the scar across his face, an old wound from Blackwater Bay, or from the many battles that had come after, but it was clear he didn't recall how he had gotten it. He turned at Bran's approach. For a moment, recognition seemed to spark. Tyrion opened his mouth as if to greet the king, but the words died before they were born. He stared at Bran in the wheeled chair, that bright mind behind the confusion almost ready to assemble meaning from the pieces. Then the flicker passed, and Tyrion only managed a small, uncertain smile that turned into a frown. Bran felt a pang of guilt. Tyrion, who had fought so hard for a better world, who had matched wits with some of the most dangerous minds in the realm, now undone by the very solution he had so tirelessly chased. But it had been Bran's choice, not Tyrion's. Bran forced himself to keep his composure. He nodded gently at Tyrion, then looked out over the city. Smoke from half-lit fires drifted upward. Perhaps the small folk still remembered how to keep themselves warm or cook some meager meal. But soon the question of leadership would arise in their childlike minds. They would see the Red Keep looming on the hill, or Winterfell in the distant north, or any fortress that overshadowed them, and they would wonder, who rules here and why? Only one person could answer them now, Bran himself. But how to lead them? How to guide a land that was a clean slate, but also so fragile it could break at the faintest push? As King Bran let his hands rest on the smooth arms of his chair, he imagined a new beginning, one without the weight of old grudges, old feuds, and centuries of blood-soaked conflict. It was a chance to build a world free from the mistakes of the past. Yet that meant forging new mistakes, new struggles, for conflict was part of the human condition. He realized now that the memory wipe was not a final solution. It was only the first step toward something uncertain and fraught with its own dangers. He moved toward the throne room, leaving Tyrion behind for the moment. He did not hurry. Where would he hurry to, and for what purpose? Within the grand hall, the Iron Throne sat, an imposing silhouette in the filtered light. Guards stood at the doors, vacant stares beneath their helmets. A few highborn courtiers, awake early for matters of state, roamed the wings of the hall, but their faces held only bewilderment. The pillars, the banners, the golden floors were all the same as they had been the day before, but the people within them had changed beyond measure. Seeing them like this, Bran felt a chill. He was the only one who remembered, the only one who knew the cost of the battles fought here, the illusions of power that had driven men and women to commit horrors. He had wanted to free them of that weight, but now the emptiness seemed almost cruel. He directed his chair to the dais, where the Iron Throne loomed, a twisted mass of swords, melted and reforged during the Targaryen conquests. It represented everything he had strived to move beyond. Bran stared at it, his mind drifting back to the moment the Great Council had named him king. He remembered Tyrion's speech, the uncertain acceptance of the lords of Westeros. He remembered the final betrayal of Daenerys Targaryen, the blood spilled in King's Landing, the near destruction of the city. He closed his eyes against that memory. No one else recalled it now. Only he did. Would that prove a blessing or a curse? He heard soft footsteps behind him. Slowly he turned. Brienne of Tarth stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in partial armor. Her eyes, blue as a summer sky, were clouded with confusion, but her posture held a warrior's discipline. As she looked at Bran, her hand touched the hilt of her sword. She wasn't threatening him. She simply recognized the blade as something significant, something that called to her sense of duty or identity, even if she did not remember its origin. She opened her mouth, struggling to speak. A jumbled series of sounds emerged. She was trying to recall a name. Perhaps Bran, perhaps Your Grace. Eventually, she fell silent, lowering her head as if embarrassed by her inability to articulate her thoughts. Bran offered her a gentle smile. Despite all the confusion, he could sense in her the unshakable loyalty that had always defined her. Some traits, some instincts, ran deeper than conscious memory. He raised a hand, beckoning her closer. Hesitantly, she approached. She towered over him, a silent sentinel. Bran pointed to himself, saying, "Bran." The name felt odd on his tongue, as if speaking it aloud in this new world stripped it of meaning. She frowned, brow creased, then attempted to repeat it. It took 2 tries before she managed a soft approximation. "Bra." Another try, "Bran." She touched her armored breastplate, as if to figure out her own name, but no clarity came. Her expression remained pained. A lump rose in Bran's throat. He wanted to reassure her, to say it was all right, that she was Brienne of Tarth, a knight of unwavering honor, that she had protected so many people and sworn so many oaths. But to speak all that now felt pointless. The words would mean nothing. She would only stare at him, uncomprehending. He reached out and took her hand. Her palm was calloused, bearing the marks of a life spent wielding a sword. A flicker of surprise passed over her features, but then her gaze softened. Perhaps she recognized the compassion in his expression, or perhaps she sensed a thread of familiarity in his presence. The moment was quiet, profound, and both comforting and heartbreaking. A clatter of footsteps echoed in the hall, drawing Bran's attention to the side entrance. Ser Davos Seaworth appeared, accompanied by 2 guards. Like Tyrion and Brienne, Davos wore confusion on his lined face, but there was a tenacity in his eyes. Something in him had always been practical, a survivor. Even with no memory of how he had served as hand or advisor, he retained the reflex to search out answers. He paused upon seeing Bran, gave a short nod of acknowledgement that seemed more instinct than conscious courtesy. The guards behind him hovered uncertainly. Davos turned, scanning the throne room, as though searching for something or someone he'd lost. Then his gaze settled back on Bran, a mixture of wariness and hope shining there, as though he sensed that this young man in the wheeled chair might have the answers to the questions rattling in his mind. Bran exhaled softly, turning his chair to face them. This was his new court, empty of memory, but still bound by old impulses of loyalty and respect. The next steps were crucial. The realm had to be guided, or it would collapse into panic and anarchy. People would starve, petty despots might arise, or opportunistic sellswords from Essos could exploit the confusion. Bran had to create a structure that would hold. But how to teach them their roles without reintroducing the very burdens of identity and history he had striven to erase? He did not have a perfect answer, but he suspected that the bonds of empathy and cooperation had to replace the old alliances of blood and steel. Perhaps this was his chance to end the feudal hierarchy once and for all. No more lords and small folk, but only people living and working together. He needed help. He might be the 3-eyed raven, but he was still a boy in a chair who had never walked on 2 strong legs. If the realm was to be reshaped, he would need those who retained their skill sets. Tyrion's cunning, Davos's practicality, Brienne's sense of justice, Samwell Tarly's thirst for knowledge, though Sam was far away in Old Town if he was still there at all. Yet each of them had been stripped of the memories that formed their moral and intellectual foundation. How to rekindle that spark without returning the realm to the old hatreds? Bran wove through the hall, glancing back at those few who looked to him, speaking softly, a few words at a time. "Safe," he said, and "stay," while placing a hand over his heart, hoping to convey reassurance. Some of them mirrored his gestures, echoing the words in uncertain tones. A seed was planted. Little by little, they might build a new language for this new world. Still the common tongue, but purified of the connotations that had shaped it for centuries. He felt the immensity of the task weigh heavily on him. Even if he managed to organize King's Landing, he still had the rest of the continent to consider. He left the throne room and navigated the corridors toward the courtyard. On the way, he passed a cluster of small folk who'd found their way inside. Perhaps they were scullery maids, stable hands, or street vendors. They stood close together for comfort, eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of something familiar. Some recognized clothing or objects in a vague, passing sense, but the whys and hows were lost. A sense of camaraderie formed among them, simply because they shared the same confusion. One of them offered Bran a piece of bread from a satchel. He accepted it with thanks, nodding, though the man clearly did not understand the word, only the tone. Bran tore off a piece and ate, surprised that even in his short reign, he had seldom tasted bread so warm. Perhaps the act of survival was so inherent that a city of amnesiacs would still remember how to bake. He reached the courtyard, where the clatter of hooves and stamping feet indicated the stables were near. Horses whinnied, uneasy at their handlers' sudden confusion and lack of familiarity. Bran wondered how widespread the memory loss was among beasts, if at all. Probably they never carried the same burden of conscious recollection as men did. A horse would remain a horse, but a stable boy now was a man adrift. Still, that stable boy might retain enough muscle memory to feed and tend the horse, as the habit was deeply ingrained. Bran paused to watch. A youth, no older than 14, was trying to calm a large mare. He stroked her mane, making soft, soothing sounds. The horse responded, comforted by the gentle attention. Something in that moment reassured Bran that humanity, even robbed of its past, was not lost. Caring gestures, empathy, these persisted on a level deeper than historical memory. He saw a group forming near the stables. 4 or 5 people, including a woman who wore a tarnished circlet that might indicate highborn status, and a man with a blacksmith's apron. They were trying to speak, pointing at objects around them. Bran stopped, observing from a distance. One pointed at a horseshoe, another at a broken cartwheel, and they exchanged halting, half-formed words. Bit by bit, they seemed to be piecing together a rudimentary understanding of each other. Relearning, rebuilding. In that moment, Bran realized that his initial fear, that the people would be reduced to infantile dependency, was somewhat misplaced. People were adaptive creatures. Even with no memory of the past, they could figure out the present. This was both uplifting and unsettling. If they were so quick to relearn old skills, they might also rediscover old vices like ambition, greed, and envy. The question was whether those vices would manifest in the same patterns without the inherited grudges and the social structures that had reinforced them. For a while, Bran simply observed. He watched the city that he had stripped of its collective memory slowly awaken to a day of raw, unfiltered possibility. A man discovered a well, realized he was thirsty, and learned to draw water. A group discovered the kitchens in the Red Keep and began rummaging for food, eventually cooking a meal over a fire, guided by the simple logic of combining ingredients and heat. Others drifted onto the streets, wide-eyed at the labyrinth of buildings. Some stared up at the sky, astonished by the flight of birds. A few touched the city walls with reverence, though they had no reason to do so. Some primal sense told them these walls were important, protective. He found a cluster of white-robed figures near the Great September of Baelor, the symbol of the faith of the Seven. They drifted in and out of its wide doors like ghosts. The statues of the Seven would mean nothing to them now. The elaborate theology was erased. Yet, within that marble edifice, the beautiful stained glass windows, the grand altars, and the hush of candlelight seemed to stir something in them. Perhaps an echo of spiritual awe. Would a new religion form here, or would the same gods be rediscovered and reinterpreted? The sight left Bran reflective. The gods themselves were not wiped away, only the people's knowledge of them. The question was whether the faith was something inherent or something taught. In time, men might craft new gods or revert to old ones. The hearts of mortals, after all, yearned for meaning. Bran rolled onward through the city, witnessing these small miracles of rebirth. A man spontaneously began to hum a tune, a lullaby. He had no memory of it, but the melody lived in him, possibly from earliest childhood. Others gathered around, enthralled by the sound, and soon, one of the women tried to sing along, though no words came to her, just the cadence of notes. Like that, an impromptu performance took shape on the street corner. On another street, 2 men argued over something, jabbing fingers at each other's chests. Their frustration grew, but lacking a deep well of personal grudges. The anger soon sputtered out. They parted ways, each heading in a different direction, still grumbling quietly. The seeds of conflict remained. Men could always disagree, but it was no longer fueled by ancestral hatred or personal vendetta. As night fell, King's Landing grew quieter. Even the amnesiac population sensed that darkness brought with it a need for rest. People huddled in small groups, forming new communities for safety, or found rooms that felt as though they might once have been theirs. Bran returned to the Red Keep's Godswood, exhausted from the day's silent witnessing. He felt a swell of relief that the city hadn't torn itself apart in fear. Instead, they were like a newborn community, searching for collective ways to survive. But this was only the beginning. Soon they would wonder about leadership, property, laws. If no memory existed of the Iron Throne or the nobility, how long would it be before they tried to reassemble the same structures that had once enslaved them to endless conflict? In the quiet gloom beneath the weirwood's red leaves, Bran let out a tremulous sigh. The memory of all that had been lost, all that he alone retained, weighed on him. Robb, his brother; Ned, his father; Catelyn, his mother; the old days in Winterfell when he was a boy who dreamed of knighthood; all the tragedies that followed. He missed them with an ache that never truly dulled. Yet he had used his power to remove from Westeros the capacity to remember those tragedies, the horrors and lessons both. He had done it believing it was the only way to save the realm from itself. Now the future was an endless question. Could peace be forged on a foundation of universal amnesia? Or would the same flaws of humanity rebuild the towers of tyranny that had toppled so many times before? At dawn, Bran summoned the handful of people who still recognized his presence as something central. Brienne was there, still clad in half-armor, hand resting on the pommel of her sword. Tyrion had found new clothes, though he wore them awkwardly, as if uncertain why he had chosen them. Davos hovered near, arms crossed, glancing around with measuring eyes. A few knights of the Kingsguard, or what passed for them now, stood by the pillars, trying to recall the sense of duty that had once defined them. None of them spoke properly, but they attempted to. They formed short, broken phrases, mostly nonsense. But all of them looked to Bran with the hope of direction. Bran could sense their trust, or at least a curiosity that might grow into trust. He began to communicate with gestures and simple words, a kind of rudimentary sign language. He pointed at his chest, said Bran, then pointed at each of them, encouraging them to make sounds that might become their names. Brienne managed something that sounded like Bree, a truncated form of her name. Tyrion muttered something close to Tai, while Davos gave a guttural Davos that came out haltingly. The assembled guards mumbled random syllables. One said Pod, as though trying to recall Podrick. It was a start, a flicker of identity emerging from the ashes. Bran nodded, encouraging them with smiles and repeated gestures, praising each small success. They repeated their names to one another, forging a brand new bond in the act of naming themselves. It felt almost biblical, a new Adam naming the beasts of the field, or the beasts naming each other without the memory of a biblical past. Over the next days, confusion persisted, but a semblance of routine took shape. People naturally gravitated toward tasks they felt instinctively suited to. The smiths found forges and hammered metal, unsure what their creations were for but driven by the desire to shape and craft. The cooks prepared meals in large kitchens, feeding themselves and others. Livestock was herded, crops were tended outside the city walls. Some individuals walked the battlements of the Red Keep, scanning the horizon as though expecting some threat. Yet they had no concept of what that threat might be, only an ingrained sense that watchmen were necessary. This emergent social order was raw, flexible, and guided by immediate need rather than the weight of tradition. Bran found that even among the highborn who remained in King's Landing, the distinction of birth meant little now. A lady might wake up in her lavish chamber but feel no claim to wealth or power. She might simply wander out and share a meal with whomever she met, not caring about the difference between gold plates and wooden bowls. The concept of personal property was tenuous. At first, there were no real quarrels over possessions, but eventually people began to recognize that some objects or spaces were more comfortable, more desirable. The seeds of jealousy sprouted here and there. A man might look upon a richly furnished room and wonder why he slept in the stables. A woman might see another with a fine cloak and wonder why she herself wore rags. Subtle tensions flickered. Without the memory of law or punishment, such disagreements might escalate. Then one evening, a scuffle broke out near the Blackwater Rush. One man tried to seize another's fish, believing it was nicer than his own. They shouted, though the words were broken, and threw punches. A small crowd gathered, uncertain how to react. Brienne, passing by, felt the innate urge to intervene. She separated them, standing a full head taller, her presence enough to quell their aggression. They retreated, nursing bruises. The crowd dispersed. That was the first instance of violence Bran had observed since the memory wipe. Only a mild fight, but a reminder that conflict was inevitable. If left unchecked, it could grow as it always had. He saw the path now. They would eventually form smaller factions, accumulate resentments, fight over resources, and in time, echo the patterns of the old world. Perhaps not with the same banners and bloodlines, but with the same primal impulses of fear and greed. Troubled by these thoughts, Bran moved quietly into the night, returning to the Godswood. He placed his hand against the weirwood trunk and slipped into the green dream once more. He roamed across Westeros in spirit, seeing how the memory wipe had affected other regions. In Winterfell, Sansa Stark stood in the courtyard, wearing plain clothes against the biting northern wind. She was surrounded by confused northerners, many who had once sworn fealty to her or to House Stark. Now they only knew the cold, the stone walls, and an inexplicable sense of loyalty to this red-haired woman who exuded calm assurance. Even stripped of her memories, Sansa's poise remained. She guided them by example, urging them, through gestures and simple words, to store food, to light fires, to remain a community. A ghost of the Lady of Winterfell's leadership manifested in her actions, even if the reasons behind it were lost. Bran felt a proud ache in his chest. His sister was forging a path of kindness, even in ignorance. Far to the south, in Dorne, the sun-scorched sands shimmered beneath a brilliant sky. The proud Dornish lords and ladies roamed the water gardens, perplexed by the mosaics and fountains. Some simply sprawled in the shade, letting the heat lull them into somnolence, while others swam in the pools without concern for rank or station. The entire region seemed to have embraced a lazy tranquility, at least for now. In the Westerlands, Lannisport and Casterly Rock were quiet. People wandered the halls of the great fortress, gazing at tapestries of the Golden Lion with no idea of its meaning. Mines and forges lay untended, but eventually, some would drift down to them, drawn by an instinct to reclaim metal from the earth. The seeds of greed might lie dormant in that land's gold. In Old Town, the great citadel was filled with acolytes and maesters who had lost all recollection of their vast repository of knowledge. They roamed the library, flipping through dusty tomes, unable to read the words. Yet some primal curiosity stirred. They fingered the pages reverently, drawn to the idea that these objects had meaning. A candle flame flickered over parchment, illuminating writing that now seemed like arcane scribbles. As Bran watched, he felt an odd mixture of sadness and hope. So much knowledge, so many records of triumph and tragedy. Gone to them. Yet they were still drawn to understanding. Perhaps in time they would learn anew. Bran withdrew from his vision and let the hush of the gods would envelop him. The city around him slumbered, thousands of souls adrift in dreamless night. He wondered if their dreams were also cleansed. Perhaps they dreamt in images without context. The children of the forest had once told the first men that the weirwood saw all, remembered all. Now that the people had forgotten, the land itself was their only memory. And Bran was part of that land. For the first time since the moment he accepted the role of the three-eyed raven, he felt wholly alone. Mira Reed was gone, off to her own life. Arya was across the seas. Jon Snow was far in the north, or so Bran suspected, living a life beyond the wall. Would any of them even remember their own names now? The prospect brought a twinge of sorrow, but also a sense of cosmic calm. Perhaps even Jon's heartbreak over Daenerys and the war had been lifted from him. Perhaps that was the mercy in all of this. At dawn, Bran convened once more with those who seemed to gravitate to him. They formed a loose circle in the Red Keep's courtyard. Tyrion, Brienne, Davos, Podrick, a few others who had apparently been part of the royal household. They were learning to speak again, forming rudimentary sentences, though often it was more gestures and single words. Bran pointed to a map of Westeros laid out on a stone table, a relic from a time before. He tapped his finger where King's Landing was, then mimed walking his fingers northward along the map, making a shivering gesture for cold. They watched, brows furrowed, trying to glean his meaning. Then he moved his finger to the west and mimed a digging motion, as if mining. The east, by the coast, miming ships. He was trying to convey the realm's shape and resources, that there were other places beyond these walls. And they needed to rebuild not just a city, but an entire continent. Through halting attempts, Tyrion, Brienne, and Davos each gave a sign of understanding, or at least partial comprehension. Bran then drew a circle around King's Landing on the map, indicating with a wave of his hand that they should gather or unify this area first. They nodded. Next, he pointed at Tyrion, then at the city's sprawl, as if to suggest that Tyrion coordinate tasks. Tyrion stared, confusion evident, but then something lit in his eyes, an echo of the cunning mind that had once shaped the fate of kingdoms. He offered a short grunt, tapped his chest, and repeated, "Ty run," as if that was the best he could do with his name. Then he pointed outward, miming the distribution of supplies. It wasn't exactly the performance of a brilliant strategist, but it was a start. Davos, for his part, was directed to the docks. He frowned but nodded, as though compelled by a sense of maritime familiarity. Bran asked to watch over the city's safety, placing a hand on her sword hilt, then pointing around in a sweeping motion. She straightened, apparently understanding, her face set in determined lines. It was the recreation of a small council, with each member holding fragments of their old roles, but with an innocence that had never existed in the previous political arrangement. There were no hidden agendas, no personal vendettas, no contradictory loyalties, only the puzzle of survival. Bran watched them disperse, a thin smile on his lips. The weight on his chest was immense, but in moments like this, he felt the faint stirring of hope. He wheeled himself to a balcony that overlooked the city. King's Landing spread out below, bathed in the amber glow of morning. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and people moved through the streets in search of meaning or sustenance. It was as if the city was simultaneously ancient and newborn, old stones hosting new souls. He closed his eyes, let the breeze ruffle his hair. The memory wipe had succeeded. The entire realm was free from the ancient burdens that had shaped it so violently. Now the question was whether that freedom would yield a better fate or simply a different cycle of pain. Time, slow and steady as the turning of seasons, began to piece together new rhythms in King's Landing. Each day, Tyrion oversaw small groups that ventured out to gather food and resources from the fields, distributing them so that hunger would not lead to savage desperation. Davos organized the docks, ensuring that fishermen still put out to sea, their hands guided by instincts honed over years of labor. Brienne walked the streets with a handful of would-be guards, breaking up any fights or thefts. She didn't remember the concept of knighthood, but she remembered duty and fairness, as though they were etched into her bones. In the evenings, groups gathered around fires to share meager meals and attempt conversation. A new vocabulary emerged, some of it reminiscent of the old common tongue, some of it shaped by the improvisations of amnesia. Yet they were forging a culture from scratch in real time under the gentle guidance of a king they barely recognized. Occasionally, confusion flared into panic. A child would cry for a mother, or a mother search for a missing child, and neither would know how to ask for help. People wandered the labyrinthine streets, losing themselves in the twisting alleys of Flea Bottom or the grandeur of the Dragon Pit. But others would help, drawn by empathy that neither needed memory nor law to exist. Bit by bit, they created improvised signals for help, for directions, for warnings. If trouble sparked, Brienne or her guards stepped in, comforting or restraining as needed. The seeds of law and order took root, not because it was enforced by a distant monarchy, but because it served everyone's immediate needs. Even so, Bran could feel the undercurrents of tension. It was easy to keep a city together in the short term, but what about the long haul? A month passed under this new order. Bran began to see roads cleared of debris, small markets forming. People were trading objects, sometimes bartering bread for a spoon or a warm cloak for a cup. Those with mechanical aptitude repaired broken carts and wagons. The city seemed to breathe again, no longer paralyzed by shock. The pace of this new life was slower than before, more communal. Yet questions began to arise that the meager vocabulary couldn't fully address. Why did some people have more robust shelters than others? Why did they live behind the Red Keep walls while others lived in cramped shacks outside? The concept of fairness weighed on them, though they had no memory of the feudal system. A handful of them began to gather near the gates of the keep, pointing and frowning, wondering why they weren't allowed inside. Brienne and her guards tried to keep order, but the people's indignation was palpable. The seeds of rebellion, ironically the same seeds that had once toppled dynasties, grew again, though for different reasons. Bran decided to open the gates. He instructed the guards, using gestures and short words, to let anyone come and go. The throne room, the courtyards, the halls that had once been reserved for royalty now opened to the masses, who wandered with awe through the corridors, marveling at the grandeur. They sat in the hall, ate their meals on the polished floors, and even dozed off on the plush chairs that once served visiting dignitaries. The old hierarchies vanished in the swirl of childlike wonder. If there was any significance to the Iron Throne, it was lost on them. A few people approached it, touching the melted swords curiously. Some bled when they brushed too sharply, stepping back in fear. Perhaps the throne still had a way of drawing blood, as it had for countless kings in the past. But no memory told them it was an object of power, so it remained a dangerously uncomfortable seat that no one wanted. To the north, Sansa managed Winterfell in a similar vein, though news of her progress reached Bran only in the faint glimpses of green dreams. He saw her welcoming the winter snows with calm acceptance. He saw the people rallying around her gentle guidance, forging a stable community within the castle walls. The forging of these communities happened across Westeros. Pockets of people rediscovering how to live in a land with a fractured, half-remembered language. What they lacked in tradition, they made up for in immediacy. Each day demanded problem-solving. The Night's Watch, or what remained of it, found themselves in cold confusion at the wall. Some deserted, wandering south until they found a warmer place to survive. Others stayed, for some gut-level sense of duty. They understood little of the threat beyond the wall, or even what the wall was for, but they recognized its significance. Another month rolled by, and still no one had the knowledge or inclination to reorganize a large-scale army or start a war. Bran spent his time gently tutoring the small council. Tyrion especially was quick to relearn. It was uncanny how swiftly his mind pieced together language and strategy once more. Within 2 months, Tyrion could form broken but comprehensible sentences, and he orchestrated the distribution of resources with surprising efficiency. He didn't remember being Hand of the King, but some part of him recognized that he was good at leadership and organization. By the 3rd month, he was conversing in a manner that resembled the old speech, though he lacked references to the past. He was building a new vocabulary free of old slights and references. He referred to Bran as the guide more often than king, because the notion of kingship was foreign to him. Yet he deferred to Bran's direction, as if sensing a greater wisdom in the young man's calm gaze. Sometimes Tyrion asked questions. Where did the big building come from? Why was there a throne made of swords? Bran would explain as simply as he could, using the new words they'd invented for forging, fighting, seat, memory, forgetting. Tyrion grew perplexed but accepted the partial explanations. The notion of a past cataclysm that had erased their recollection was hinted at, but Bran never confessed his own role in it. He was not sure how Tyrion would react if he realized that Bran had stolen the memories of an entire continent. Perhaps Tyrion would see it as a monstrous act, or perhaps he would accept it as necessary. Bran feared the question enough to avoid the confrontation. Eventually, Some of the refugees from other parts of the continent drifted into King's Landing, drawn by the roads or a sense that more people gathered in the capital. They carried with them the same confusion, at tapestries of the Golden Lion with no idea of its meaning. Mines and forges lay untended, but eventually, some would drift down to them, drawn by an instinct to reclaim metal from the earth. The seeds of greed might lie dormant in that land's gold. In Old Town, the great citadel was filled with acolytes and maesters who had lost all recollection of their vast repository of knowledge. They roamed the library, flipping through dusty tomes, unable to read the words. Yet some primal curiosity stirred. They fingered the pages reverently, drawn to the idea that these objects had meaning. A candle flame flickered over parchment, illuminating writing that now seemed like arcane scribbles. As Bran watched, he felt an odd mixture of sadness and hope. So much knowledge, so many records of triumph and tragedy. Gone to them. Yet they were still drawn to understanding. Perhaps in time they would learn anew. Bran withdrew from his vision and let the hush of the gods would envelop him. The city around him slumbered, thousands of souls adrift in dreamless night. He wondered if their dreams were also cleansed. Perhaps they dreamt in images without context. The children of the forest had once told the first men that the weirwoods saw all, remembered all. Now that the people had forgotten, the land itself was their only memory. And Bran was part of that land. For the first time since the moment he accepted the role of the three-eyed raven, he felt wholly alone. Mira Reed was gone, off to her own life. Arya was across the seas. Jon Snow was far in the north, or so Bran suspected, living a life beyond the wall. Would any of them even remember their own names now? The prospect brought a twinge of sorrow, but also a sense of cosmic calm. Perhaps even Jon's heartbreak over Daenerys and the war had been lifted from him. Perhaps that was the mercy in all of this. At dawn, Bran convened once more with those who seemed to gravitate to him. They formed a loose circle in the Red Keep's courtyard. Tyrion, Brienne, Davos, Podrick, a few others who had apparently been part of the royal household. They were learning to speak again, forming rudimentary sentences, though often it was more gestures and single words. Bran pointed to a map of Westeros laid out on a stone table, a relic from a time before. He tapped his finger where King's Landing was, then mimed walking his fingers northward along the map, making a shivering gesture for cold. They watched, brows furrowed, trying to glean his meaning. Then he moved his finger to the west and mimed a digging motion, as if mining. The east, by the coast, miming ships. He was trying to convey the realm's shape and resources, that there were other places beyond these walls. And they needed to rebuild not just a city, but an entire continent. Through halting attempts, Tyrion, Brienne, and Davos each gave a sign of understanding, or at least partial comprehension. Bran then drew a circle around King's Landing on the map, indicating with a wave of his hand that they should gather or unify this area first. They nodded. Next, he pointed at Tyrion, then at the city's sprawl, as if to suggest that Tyrion coordinate tasks. Tyrion stared, confusion evident, but then something lit in his eyes, an echo of the cunning mind that had once shaped the fate of kingdoms. He offered a short grunt, tapped his chest, and repeated, "Ty run," as if that was the best he could do with his name. Then he pointed outward, miming the distribution of supplies. It wasn't exactly the performance of a brilliant strategist, but it was a start. Davos, for his part, was directed to the docks. He frowned but nodded, as though compelled by a sense of maritime familiarity. Bran asked to watch over the city's safety, placing a hand on her sword hilt, then pointing around in a sweeping motion. She straightened, apparently understanding, her face set in determined lines. It was the recreation of a small council, with each member holding fragments of their old roles, but with an innocence that had never existed in the previous political arrangement. There were no hidden agendas, no personal vendettas, no contradictory loyalties, only the puzzle of survival. Bran watched them disperse, a thin smile on his lips. The weight on his chest was immense, but in moments like this, he felt the faint stirring of hope. He wheeled himself to a balcony that overlooked the city. King's Landing spread out below, bathed in the amber glow of morning. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and people moved through the streets in search of meaning or sustenance. It was as if the city was simultaneously ancient and newborn, old stones hosting new souls. He closed his eyes, let the breeze ruffle his hair. The memory wipe had succeeded. The entire realm was free from the ancient burdens that had shaped it so violently. Now the question was whether that freedom would yield a better fate or simply a different cycle of pain. Time, slow and steady as the turning of seasons, began to piece together new rhythms in King's Landing. Each day, Tyrion oversaw small groups that ventured out to gather food and resources from the fields, distributing them so that hunger would not lead to savage desperation. Davos organized the docks, ensuring that fishermen still put out to sea, their hands guided by instincts honed over years of labor. Brienne walked the streets with a handful of would-be guards, breaking up any fights or thefts. She didn't remember the concept of knighthood, but she remembered duty and fairness, as though they were etched into her bones. In the evenings, groups gathered around fires to share meager meals and attempt conversation. A new vocabulary emerged, some of it reminiscent of the old common tongue, some of it shaped by the improvisations of amnesia. Yet they were forging a culture from scratch in real time under the gentle guidance of a king they barely recognized. Occasionally, confusion flared into panic. A child would cry for a mother, or a mother search for a missing child, and neither would know how to ask for help. People wandered the labyrinthine streets, losing themselves in the twisting alleys of Flea Bottom or the grandeur of the Dragon Pit. But others would help, drawn by empathy that neither needed memory nor law to exist. Bit by bit, they created improvised signals for help, for directions, for warnings. If trouble sparked, Brienne or her guards stepped in, comforting or restraining as needed. The seeds of law and order took root, not because it was enforced by a distant monarchy, but because it served everyone's immediate needs. Even so, Bran could feel the undercurrents of tension. It was easy to keep a city together in the short term, but what about the long haul? A month passed under this new order. Bran began to see roads cleared of debris, small markets forming. People were trading objects, sometimes bartering bread for a spoon or a warm cloak for a cup. Those with mechanical aptitude repaired broken carts and wagons. The city seemed to breathe again, no longer paralyzed by shock. The pace of this new life was slower than before, more communal. Yet questions began to arise that the meager vocabulary couldn't fully address. Why did some people have more robust shelters than others? Why did they live behind the Red Keep walls while others lived in cramped shacks outside? The concept of fairness weighed on them, though they had no memory of the feudal system. A handful of them began to gather near the gates of the keep, pointing and frowning, wondering why they weren't allowed inside. Brienne and her guards tried to keep order, but the people's indignation was palpable. The seeds of rebellion, ironically the same seeds that had once toppled dynasties, grew again, though for different reasons. Bran decided to open the gates. He instructed the guards, using gestures and short words, to let anyone come and go. The throne room, the courtyards, the halls that had once been reserved for royalty now opened to the masses, who wandered with awe through the corridors, marveling at the grandeur. They sat in the hall, ate their meals on the polished floors, and even dozed off on the plush chairs that once served visiting dignitaries. The old hierarchies vanished in the swirl of childlike wonder. If there was any significance to the Iron Throne, it was lost on them. A few people approached it, touching the melted swords curiously. Some bled when they brushed too sharply, stepping back, even if their minds did not. Quietly, Bran debated whether to restore their memories. He, alone, might do it if he reversed the subtle threads of magic that bound them in forgetfulness. But that would risk unraveling everything. If Jon Snow remembered his lineage as Aegon Targaryen, would he try to claim a throne? If Sansa remembered her suffering and ascension in the north, would she resent this new world? Would she demand the old ways, seeking a proud, independent north once more? Perhaps they would be furious with Bran for usurping their memories, for playing God with their lives. Or perhaps they would love him still. The risk seemed too great to chance. Yet he felt their yearning. A piece of them sensed something was amiss, as if their lives had a missing chapter. He remained silent. Time passed in uneasy harmony. Sansa acclimated to the city, offering her quiet intelligence to the new council, forging a rapport with Tyrion as if drawn to the echoes of a bond from another life. Jon slipped out beyond the walls, patrolling with Brienne and the guard, feeling more at home with the sword, the saddle, the quiet vigilance of a watcher. This arrangement persisted for another half-year, forging a stable community that grew daily. Word spread that King's Landing was a place of peace, drawing folk from all over the realm. Many visited, bringing rumors of smaller fiefs or petty kings that had arisen, but found no reason to wage war on a city that welcomed them with open gates. Yet the seeds of memory continued to sprout in unexpected ways. Some dreamt of dragons, others of frozen undead. A nameless dread lingered in their hearts. Whispers circulated. People began to ask Bran about the old cataclysms, about why the city had so many scorched ruins, about the significance of the ruined Red Keep towers. He provided gentle half-truths. Old war, gone now, but the thirst for knowledge grew. A small group formed, calling themselves Seekers, determined to rediscover the past. They scavenged archives, rummaged through libraries in the Red Keep, although many scrolls were burnt or unreadable. Occasionally, they'd find a partial record that sparked more questions. Over time, they began to piece together that something monumental had happened, something that had snatched away their recollection of the world. They confronted Bran, politely at first, then more insistently, demanding answers. They wanted to know who or what had robbed them of their histories. Why? Bran tried to redirect them, urging them to focus on the present and the future. But the Seekers grew dissatisfied, calling him evasive. He couldn't blame them. In the old world, he himself had sought the three-eyed raven, seeking answers. Now these Seekers were doing the same. He recognized the relentless human drive for understanding. If he stifled them, would he become the tyrant he had tried to erase? If he told them everything, would that knowledge set them free or incite them to rebellion? Dilemmas like these pressed upon him day after day. He began to see that memory, even in fragments, was not a burden to be cast off but a crucial part of human identity. Perhaps he had done more harm than good. Yet the realm was at peace. A tenuous, newborn peace, free from the monstrous bloodshed that had nearly consumed it before. Was that worth the moral cost? In unguarded moments, Bran questioned himself, a boy who had dared to play the role of a god. And though the city grew calmer and safer, an undercurrent of mystery pervaded everything. Who were we? Where did we come from? What is our true nature? Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, Bran visited the weirwood again and drifted through the green dream. He revisited the faces of the past. Ned, Catelyn, Robb, Arya, Rickon, Theon, Hodor, Mira, Jojen, even Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. The swirling memories tore at him like shards of glass. He alone bore the entire weight of Westeros's history, a lonely sentinel with no one to share the burden. He considered more than once the possibility of restoring everything. But the realm had come so far in the new direction. Would he subject them to the heartbreak and the scars that had once tormented them? During one such night, as the moon bathed the godswood in pale silver, he sensed a presence. He emerged from his trance to find Jon standing there, silent, watching him. The flicker of recognition in Jon's eyes was deeper than before. He stepped forward, expression taut with urgency. He placed a hand on Bran's shoulder, parted his lips, and spoke in a voice that trembled with something akin to memory. What happened? The words were labored, but the intensity behind them was fierce. He wanted the truth. Bran gazed at him with sorrow. He wondered if the old bond of brotherhood still connected them across the chasm of forgetting. In a halting mix of the new vocabulary and the few old words that had slipped through, Bran tried to explain. He said that once the land was in pain, consumed by war. He gestured as though flames licked the air, as though swords clashed. He tried to convey that many died, that families were torn apart, that monstrous battles ravaged the continent. Jon listened intently, his eyes glistening. Perhaps some part of him recalled the carnage. Bran placed a hand on the weirwood trunk, trying to show Jon that he had used its power to remove that memory from everyone. Erased it. He clasped Jon's hand in his own, pressing their palms together, hoping to convey that it was done out of love, out of a desire to save them all from endless suffering. But guilt weighed on each word. Jon closed his eyes. A single tear slid down his cheek. When he opened them again, he looked at Bran with an expression that combined gratitude and horror, acceptance and loss. The complexities warred on his face. Then, wordlessly, he pulled Bran into an embrace, the first true embrace they had shared in years. Bran closed his eyes, letting his head rest on Jon's shoulder, feeling the warmth of a brother's love, even if that word, brother, no longer held the same meaning for Jon. In that moment, Bran realized that a part of Jon might understand after all, might forgive. Perhaps that was enough. The next morning, Jon departed King's Landing with a small party, heading north. They left quietly. Sansa remained, forging a new bond with Tyrion and the city. Brienne, Davos, and Podrick continued to keep the peace. And Bran watched it all from the vantage point of the Red Keep's balconies or the Godswood's quiet corners. He oversaw a realm that was once again learning to dream without the shackles of memory. It was not perfect. Conflict brewed here and there, but the cataclysms of old seemed distant. He told himself over and over that this was the right path, that the realm had to learn anew, that it deserved a chance to build a future without the ghosts of the past. Yet, as the seasons stretched on, as children were born who would never know the old lineage, as elders passed away who might have recalled something more, the realm truly became an uncharted land. Some said the past was lost forever, a story that could never be recovered. But the realm endured. Rivers flowed, harvests grew, people laughed and quarreled and loved, forging new families without the burdens of ancestry. Over time, a new tapestry of culture and tradition emerged, woven from threads of simpler beliefs and shared experiences. Small pockets of hostility or ambition flared, but they did not coalesce into grand armies or noble houses. The people had no memory of how to muster large-scale war. Instead, they lived day by day, forging alliances of friendship and trade, often mediated by those with calmer dispositions. Bran aged in the midst of it. His hair grew thinner, his face sharper, the lines of wisdom and sorrow etched deeper around his eyes. He remained in his chair, the living memory of Westeros, the only keeper of the full tapestry of the old world. A generation rose to adulthood not knowing any banner but the sun and the moon, not caring about the differences between north and south. All they knew was that they lived in a land called Westeros, named so by the few fragments that had survived, and they were free to walk it as they pleased. Though some might settle in the places that suited them best, many wandered. A new sense of freedom pervaded the land. The common folk no longer feared men in steel who demanded taxes for lords they had never seen. Instead, they worked the land for themselves, sometimes trading surpluses with neighbors. The concept of lord had evaporated, replaced by local leaders chosen informally by mutual respect. In King's Landing, people still looked to Bran as a wise figurehead, but the notion of kingship had faded. He did not disabuse them of that. He was content to remain the quiet guide, the caretaker of the realm's potential. In dreams, he still saw the old faces: Cersei, Jaime, Daenerys, Yora, Eddard, Catelyn, like echoes of a ghostly pantheon. He felt their love, their hate, their regrets, their triumphs. Sometimes he wept upon waking, longing for them, longing for the stories that were forever lost. But the day always called him back to the living, to a new generation that found wonder in building a world untainted by the cruelties of old. He would watch children chase each other through the Red Keep's corridors, squealing with laughter, unafraid of any dragon queen or mad king. He would see couples of different backgrounds unite, forging families that blended new dialects and customs. He would see marketplaces blossom with craft and color, no longer overshadowed by a looming hierarchy of house insignias. It was a Westeros that had lost its storied past, but perhaps gained a chance for a gentler future. Yet the greatest question lingered. Was this truly what was best? Time might someday reveal that the same nature that once led to dragons and wars would lead to new forms of oppression. Or perhaps the memory wipe had given people enough distance from their darkest histories to forge something better. Bran could not know the final answer. He could only live each day, guiding them with what wisdom he had, and carry the burden alone. Sometimes, at the hour between night and dawn, he would will himself to the godswood and listen to the heart tree whisper. He would place his hand on the carved face, and in the hush, he would hear the echoes of everything that had been lost. He alone would carry that memory for all time. And so it was that Bran Stark, the last three-eyed raven, had erased the memory of Westeros. The wheel had been shattered not by fire and blood, but by the soft hand of oblivion. In its place, a newborn realm struggled and learned, stumbling forward like a child taking its first uncertain steps. He watched over them with a quiet, patient love, forever aware that he held the knowledge of how they had once nearly destroyed themselves, and how they might again, if ever they reclaimed that memory. Yet he chose to hope instead, that in forgetting their worst, they might rediscover their best. And so the seasons turned, and the story of Westeros began anew, unbound by the ghosts of its past, unsure of its future, but free, truly free, in a way it had never been before. Bran Stark often sat beneath the Red Keep's ancient weirwood at twilight, when the sky above King's Landing glowed with the faint colors of setting sun and the hush of evening settled over the city. In those hours, before the lamps were lit and the people bedded down for the night, he could almost imagine the realm at peace. A realm free of ghosts, where no banners of conquest flew, where no grudges spanned centuries, and no ancient lore bound men to cruelty. And for a time, these few precious years since the memory wipe, this vision seemed nearer than it ever had during the bloody history of Westeros. Yet beneath that stillness, deeper currents swirled. As the last three-eyed raven, Bran sensed those unseen tides shifting. He felt it each time the winds changed direction and brought new voices to the city. Refugees, wanderers, curious travelers, seekers of the lost past. He heard it in the bolder questions asked at the gatherings in the old throne room, in the half-formed demands for knowledge, for recollection, for meaning. He felt it in the quiet heartbreak of Sansa's eyes when she gazed upon old tapestries in the Red Keep's corridors, as though a hidden part of her recognized the wolves adorning the cloth. And he felt it in the calm yet haunted stare of Jon Snow, the brother who wasn't truly a brother, who had come south once seeking answers and returned north again, burdened by partial truths. As the seasons turned, Bran knew the day would come when the realm's desire to remember would outgrow his single-handed attempt to guide them gently onward. In the years since Bran erased the memories of Westeros, the city had transformed. The grand architecture remained, some of it in partial ruin, some of it restored by the tireless efforts of cooperative labor, but the old notion of a crowded, stratified capital had crumbled. King's Landing had become a place of shared spaces and open gates. The small council existed in name, but no one truly thought of it as a council of lords and ladies. They were simply the best organizers, the calmest negotiators, the ones who had gravitated to Bran's side in the immediate aftermath. Tyrion, Brienne, Davos, Sansa, Podrick, and others, each leading by example, forging a new social fabric from the remnants of the old city. Gone were the rigid hierarchies of noble houses, for no one remembered bloodline or pedigree. But new structures inevitably arose. Skilled craftspeople banded together, pooling knowledge to repair roads, build boats, and smelt ore. Farmers in the surrounding countryside formed local committees to decide how best to distribute harvests. The concept of coin persisted, silver and copper minted in older times still circulated, but pure barter was more common now. Folk were just as likely to trade a sheaf of wheat for a pot of stew as they were to hand over a coin for it. After all, no one truly recalled the monarchy's laws on minting or taxation. Neither did they recall the details of old feuds that once stained these streets red. Violence, though not erased from human nature, manifested in smaller, localized conflicts, brawls, or disputes over resources, rather than organized warfare. Bran considered this a triumph of a sort. He had ended the cycles that had devoured so many generations. Yet sometimes, as he looked upon the re-greening hills beyond the city walls, he questioned himself. Had he deprived Westeros of not just its hatred, but also the lessons learned through centuries of struggle? Perhaps if no one remembered the Targaryen conquest or the Baratheon rebellion, they would also fail to understand why tyranny should never be allowed to take root again. Were they, in their innocence, all the more vulnerable if a new tyrant rose? The Seekers certainly believed so. They had started as a small group, no more than a dozen individuals who prowled the Red Keep's dusty archives and the partially scorched library, eyes aflame with curiosity. Over time, their numbers swelled. Some were drawn by intangible dreams of the past, others by glimpses of names or old crests. A few had stumbled on scraps of documents or personal keepsakes that hinted at a world far more complex than the one they saw daily. They gathered in the courtyard at dusk and dawn, muttering half-understood words, building a new vocabulary of longing. They believed that if the realm knew what had once been, it could either avoid the same mistakes or reclaim some lost glory. And so, they dedicated themselves to reclaiming the collective memory Bran had taken. Many nights, a delegation of Seekers would approach Bran, or rather, approach Tyrion first, for the small man with mismatched eyes and a razor mind had become something of a statesman in this new order. They demanded audience with the guide. They sought answers about the confluence of old texts they had found. References to dragons, Targaryens, direwolves, White Walkers, and other half-mythic figures. Their questions were more direct now, for in these few years they had mastered a coherent speech pattern. It was simpler than the old common tongue but functional enough to convey complex thoughts. They asked Tyrion where these monsters and heroes had gone, what cataclysm had consumed them, and how the realm had been robbed of its memory. Tyrion could only shrug and say, "I do not know. Ask Bran. He sees more than I do," in his measured, relearned manner of speaking. And so they turned to Bran in the Godswood, where he sat with eyes half-closed, communing with the silent weirwood. They proffered brittle pages, half-burned manuscripts, defaced scrolls, demanding clarity on the cryptic phrases, Robert's Rebellion, House Stark, King Aegon, the Last Targaryen, the War for the Dawn. Each reference was a shard of glass they hoped to piece into a mirror reflecting the lost world. Bran, softly and calmly, would find a way to evade them, or to give them only fragments of truth, never the whole. Each time he withheld the fuller tale, he felt that pang of guilt. But the memory of Dragonfire in King's Landing, the slaughter of innocents, the endless dance of claims to the Iron Throne. He could not in good conscience unleash that knowledge upon a realm so newly healed. Still, the Seekers were relentless. Some whispered that Bran himself was responsible for the forgetting. Others suspected he was simply the last who remembered, a kind of prophet or cursed oracle. They tried to glean more from him. "If you recall, why can you not teach us?" But often they found him polite, kind, yet unyielding. Over time, a measure of resentment stirred among certain factions within the Seekers. There were those who believed that knowledge was vital, and to hoard it was an act of tyranny. The realm had once overthrown tyrants, so if Bran would not grant them the freedom of truth, how was he different from the kings of old? Slowly, these undercurrents began to swirl, not violently, but with growing force. Even as King's Landing thrived under communal labor, beneath that prosperity simmered an existential crisis, a longing to know who they truly were. Children of the new era did not share this longing, for they had been born into the new world with no sense of anything missing. But the adults, whose dreams might still hold echoes or shadows of the old days, found themselves haunted by phantoms. Bran sensed these stirrings like a storm forming at the horizon. The choice he had made might have saved them from immediate ruin, but it could not permanently stave off the human need for identity, the drive to place oneself in the grand tapestry of time. It was during the late harvest of that 5th year since the wiping under a crisp sky that Jon Snow returned again from the north. This time he did not come alone. He brought a small retinue of northerners, men and women who shared an almost reverential regard for him. Though none of them remembered why, it was as if some intangible quality of Jon's leadership and compassion bound them. Their arrival was heralded by outriders on the northern roads, who carried word to King's Landing that a contingent was approaching. Tyrion, Davos, and Brienne prepared to greet them at the gates, as was customary, while Sansa stood by, looking composed yet unsettled. When Jon rode in, clad in battered leathers lined with furs, an electric tension rippled through the crowd that gathered to watch. Many recognized him from his previous visit, or perhaps just sensed his significance. He nodded at them in the polite, minimal gestures that had become the new courtesy, then dismount. At his side was a woman nearly as tall as Brienne, with solemn eyes and a thin sword at her hip. Others wore thick cloaks of gray or black, marked by a single stylized direwolf's head that one among them had embroidered, a design they could not name, but felt was important. In a city that no longer truly acknowledged sigils, it was a curiosity that sparked immediate notice. Brienne laid a hand on her sword, not to threaten but to mirror the tension she felt. Tyrion, arms folded, offered a friendly nod. "Welcome," he said, in the practiced, clipped speech of the new era, hoping to convey sincerity. Jon nodded in return. Sansa drifted closer, studying Jon's face. He was older now, lines of wear around his eyes, hair flecked with silver. He looked at her with recognition that neither could fully articulate. Their bond was unspoken, older than memory. That very evening, they convened in what had once been the throne room. People now called it the Great Hall or simply the big meeting place, for only a few truly grasped the idea of a throne. The Iron Throne itself remained, but no one sat upon it. Children sometimes scrambled up its dangerous steps out of curiosity, only to be scolded by watchful adults. Before that towering silhouette of swords, Jon addressed the gathered folk. His language skills had grown more fluid. He had always been quick to adapt, but he still paused for the right words. "North," he said, tapping his chest, glancing at his companions. "We see signs. Strange." He held up a bare hand, palm outward, as though fending something off. Then he pointed to the crowd, then to the gates, miming a watchful stance. "Danger," he said, the old word borrowed from half-burned manuscripts. Tyrion, arms still crossed, furrowed his brow. "Danger? From beyond your land." His words were clipped but clear. "What shape?" Jon exhaled, wrestling with how to explain something the new tongue barely had words for. "North cold," he repeated, shivering theatrically. "Ice shapes. People dead." He shook his head, fumbling for the concept. Sansa's eyes widened slightly. Something about the mention of dead stirred distant panic. Davos, standing off to the side, rubbed at his beard, as if an old memory itched at his mind. Murmurs spread among the assembled crowd. Bran, who had been wheeled in by a dutiful guard, looked on silently. He had his hands folded in his lap, expression grave. He alone recalled the White Walkers, those eerie, ancient beings of ice that had once threatened all life in Westeros. The army of the dead had been dispersed when the Night King fell in that final battle. Yet if there were stirrings in the far north, it meant that whatever remnants lingered might be waking again. The forgetting of men did not guarantee the forgetting of powers older than men. Jon struggled on, describing in halting phrases how a party of hunters in the far north had spotted pale figures moving through the haunted forest. At first, they thought these shapes were illusions in the swirling snow. Then they found the corpses of animals, drained of life, scattered across frozen ground. Some in Jon's group had huddled close to the wall, what remained of it, and felt a deep sense of unease, as if the cold wind carried whispers. They sensed threat, though they knew not what it was or why it lurked there. A memory that was no memory at all, more a primal dread, echoing from their bones. The crowd in the hall began to murmur and shift. Some scoffed, uncertain how to process the notion of undead or icy phantoms. Others whispered that this might be related to the old cataclysm, the war that had preceded their forgetting. Jon pressed on, repeating the word danger, beckoning them to heed the warnings. Finally, Tyrion raised a hand for silence. "We see, but not sure what to do. We have no big army." The notion of amassing an armed host was foreign to them in this new era. Guards existed for local safety, but no one had reassembled the grand militaries of old. This was, of course, part of what Bran had hoped to avoid. Jon nodded, then glanced at Bran, as if seeking counsel. Bran caught his gaze and inclined his head, carefully, acknowledging the unspoken question. If the old threat stirs, do we need the old knowledge to face it? Over the following days, King's Landing buzzed with talk of the rumored danger in the far north. Some dismissed it as legend or superstition. Others took it deeply to heart, pointing out that if there had indeed been an old war, as many texts implied, maybe it had never truly ended. The seekers leaped upon the news, sifting through old scrolls with renewed zeal. Soon they uncovered references to Whites, White Walkers, the Wall, and the Long Night. The scattered fragments painted a dire portrait. An eternal winter, armies of the dead, heroes who wielded flaming swords. But every mention was couched in half-finished sentences, burned edges, lost context. They clamored for more from Bran, who quietly evaded direct answers. Tyrion, too, pressed him in private, as did Sansa, Davos, and Brienne. Was there truth to these old tales? And if so, how could the realm defend itself now, with no memory of how to unite? Bran listened, measured his response, and finally decided that the time for partial truths might be ending. In the quiet of the Godswood, he summoned a small council. Tyrion, Sansa, Davos, Brienne, Podrick, and a handful of others who had proven themselves steady in crisis. Jon was invited as well. They gathered by the carved white bark of the weirwood, whose red leaves fluttered softly in the autumn breeze. The hush of that sacred place gave them a sense of solemnity. Bran spoke slowly, forming words as precisely as he could. Before, forgetting, a great war was. Ice, death, threatened all. He paused, letting that sink in. We fought, united. North, south, all realms. We won. But cost high. Eyes widened around the circle. Tyrion's brow furrowed. Sansa bit her lip. Brienne's hand went reflexively to her sword hilt. Jon's face grew still. Davos asked, "Why forget then?" The question weighed in the air. Bran closed his eyes, recalling the horror of Dragonfire, the betrayal, the hatred that had nearly torn the realm asunder even after the threat of the Night King was ended. Because men fought men again, he said at last. Hurt, killed, wanted thrones, power, old hate, old grudges. I used a magic, stopped memory, wiped it away, thought, realm have chance, be free. A hush settled on them. Some part of them might have guessed this truth, but hearing it stated so plainly carried a profound impact. Sansa paled, Davos looked away, and Tyrion inhaled sharply. Brienne clenched her jaw. Jon's gaze, though, showed no surprise. He had suspected as much since that night in the Godswood when Bran hinted at his immense power. They stood in silence for a long moment, the breeze stirring the red leaves overhead, as if the old gods were listening. Finally, Tyrion said in a careful tone, "You took all memory, old families, old wars, old evils. We started new. But now, the old evil stirs again." He looked to Jon for confirmation, who nodded stiffly. Bran's expression was grave. "I fear the threat not fully gone. If it is real, we must stand again." Sansa found her voice. "But we do not know how," she said haltingly. "No armies, no unity." She glanced at Davos. "Realm is scattered. Indeed, the seven kingdoms as they once were did not truly exist. There were pockets of settlement, each with its own communal structure, some more organized than others, but no single banner that united them." Brienne added, "Even if we gather men, they do not remember war. They do not remember how to fight that." She gestured vaguely, as though the concept of undead armies defied simple words. They turned to Bran. The question burned in their eyes. Should the memory of that war, and of all the old alliances, be restored? And if so, how? Bran studied them, his breath coming slowly. In his mind, he recalled the cataclysms wrought by the knowledge of bloodlines and ancient feuds. But now, a new threat might require old knowledge. Jon was the first to speak. We can fight. We strong. North ready. But not enough, he said. Then he looked to Bran with a mixture of urgency and sadness. We need truth. Bran's grip tightened on the arms of his wheeled chair. The burden he had carried alone for years was now partially in the open. He glanced around the circle. Every face was etched with worry, but also with resolution. These were good men and women, shaped by the new world, free of the deeper prejudices that had once plagued their ancestors. Perhaps they could handle the truth. Perhaps they would not repeat the old cycle of hatred. Or perhaps they would. The risk loomed large. Yet, if the White Walkers truly threatened from the north, it might be that only a united Westeros, remembering how it once united, could stand firm. He closed his eyes, whispering to the weirwood, though his voice was audible to the group. I can restore some memories, enough to show unity war alliance. But I fear old hates come too. Sansa's hands trembled, but she lowered them to stillness. We must choose, or face unknown terror. She gazed at Tyrion, then at Brienne, then at Davos. I trust we can handle the past better now. Tyrion exhaled a shaky breath. His eyes flicked to Bran. It is big risk, but perhaps needed. A wry smile tugged at his lips. We better people now? The question hung between them, half a statement, half a hope. Jon nodded. We do what must. The next night, in the hushed darkness of the Godswood, Bran made his decision. He asked the council members, those willing, to gather around the weirwood. Torches flickered, casting dancing shadows across the carved white bark. Some among the seekers were invited too, particularly those who had shown themselves thoughtful and measured. Not all were permitted, for Bran feared that an immediate, full revelation to the entire city would spark chaos. But a representative group, about 20 souls, encircled the heart tree. The old face carved into the bark seemed to watch them with timeless sorrow. Bran, seated in his chair, placed his palms against the trunk. The sigh of the wind through the leaves sounded like a faint whisper of lament. He closed his eyes, letting the ancient power of the weirwood network flow through him. The hush fell deeper over the assembly. One by one, they felt a subtle pull, as if invisible roots were winding around their minds, brushing aside the veil that had cloaked them for so long. The first to react was Tyrion. He gasped, staggered back a step, eyes wide with sudden flashes of recollection. The Battle of Blackwater Bay, the Red Wedding, his trial for regicide, the insults of his father, the camaraderie with Varys, the heartbreak of Daenerys' downfall, the moment he named Bran as king. He gripped the hilt of a dagger at his belt, as though the weight of 1,000 memories might crush him. Sansa uttered a ragged cry, tears streaming his faces, names and horrors poured back into her mind. Joffrey's torment, Littlefinger's betrayals, Ramsay's monstrosities, her mother's murder, her father's execution, her triumph as Lady of Winterfell. She shook so violently that Brienne caught her before she collapsed. Brienne herself stood rigid, tears glimmering in her wide blue eyes as she recalled Renly, Jaime, her oaths, the trial by combat, her promise to Catelyn Stark, her final knighting at the hands of Jaime in the halls of Winterfell. She let out a breath like a sob, pressing a hand over her heart. Davos fell to his knees, remembering Shireen, Stannis, the Battle of the Bastards, the burnt letter of Robert's parentage secrets, and all the regrets that weighed on him. A sorrowful moan escaped his lips as he recalled how the realm had bled and how a father might burn his daughter. Others among the group were similarly overwhelmed, though not all had personal ties to the darkest tragedies. Some discovered they had once been ordinary soldiers in great battles, or serving folk in noble keeps. The swirl of recollections battered them, some stumbling or collapsing. The entire Godswood was a chorus of gasps, sobs, shouts, disbelieving murmurs. Years of heartbreak, triumph, betrayal, love, and loss flooded back like a broken dam. The weight of it threatened to crush them. Jon did not collapse, but stood trembling, tears streaking his cheeks as he remembered with piercing clarity. His oath to the Night's Watch, his stabbing at Castle Black, his resurrection by Melisandre, the revelation of his Targaryen blood, his love for Daenerys, and his ultimate betrayal of her. He let out a ragged cry, burying his face in his hands, as the heartbreak and guilt resurged. Through it all, Bran remained where he was, hands pressed to the weirwood. He was guiding the memories, allowing them to flow into these minds that had been forcibly emptied, but also attempting to cushion the blow. Even so, it was a torrent. He felt their anguish. The hush of the godswood was replaced by the raw sound of so many hearts breaking anew. One by one, they tried to steady themselves, supporting each other physically or with quiet words. After the initial wave, some overcame their shock enough to console others. Brienne held Sansa, whispering apologies for all she had not been able to prevent. Tyrion helped Davos to his feet, tears in his own eyes, recalling the many foolish choices that had doomed thousands. A hushed reverence fell again, punctuated by choked sobs. Then, as their old selves merged with the new, they looked around with dazed wonder. The weirwood leaves rustled, red against white bark, as if acknowledging the storm of emotion. Finally, it was Sansa who spoke, voice shaking but clear. "We remember," she said. A wave of tears threatened again, but she pressed her lips together, swallowing the pain. All of it. Tyrion, wiping at his eyes, let out a trembling breath. "We do," he echoed, his gaze flicked to the rest. "But we are who we've been these last years, too. Both." The new, simpler identity forged in the memoryless era had become part of them. Now the old weight had returned, blending with the new. Jon, silent, stared at Bran, expression a tumult of grief and acceptance. He finally managed, "It was you who took it all away and saved us from ourselves." His words were not an accusation but a soft statement. Bran met his gaze, weary, sorrowful, and nodded. Brienne, her voice raw, asked, "What now?" She glanced around at the others. "We know the threat. If the White Walkers stir again, we must act. But the realm is not what it was." A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "Perhaps that is a blessing." Davos cleared his throat, stammering. "I recall the wars. So many wars. The realm was broken. Now it's different, quiet, almost at peace. We need to keep that, but also stand together if the dead march again." Tyrion, regaining some of his old acerbic wit, folded his arms. "We must gather the realm, but carefully. We cannot simply reassemble the Seven Kingdoms as they were. There are no great houses left in the traditional sense. Most people don't remember them. They have lived free these past few years, unburdened by oaths and overlords. We can't impose that old system, nor do we have time to create a perfect new system." Sansa, standing straighter now, said, "But we know how to unite them, at least in principle. During the Great War, we rallied the North, the Vale, the Iron Islands, Dorne, and so on. Perhaps we adapt that approach. We go to these regions, speak to them with honesty, show them that a threat looms. Try to reason with them as equals, not as superiors." She paused, then added, "If they trust us, we can gather enough force to stand against the White Walkers." Brienne nodded. "We might not call them to war. We call them to survival. It worked before, in a sense." Jon's eyes narrowed in thought. "But do we risk reawakening old feuds, old loyalties? That might tear us apart again." He glanced at Tyrion. "Can the realm handle the truth? Or will it spin into chaos if every person recalls what was done to them, or their families, or their houses?" Silence settled. That was the hardest question. The very knowledge that might save them from the undead threat could also resurrect the monstrous resentments that once fueled civil wars. Bran, hands still resting on the weirwood, stared at the group with ancient weariness. "We must be careful," he said. "A partial restoration. Enough to know how to fight, but not enough to recall all old grudges in detail. We can show them the Night King's War, the unity formed, the reason to join again." Tyrion tapped his chin, eyes glinting with strategic calculation. "Yes, that might be possible. You can direct the memories, shape what they see." Bran nodded. To an extent, it is delicate, but I can show them the truth of that war, of the living uniting. Maybe not every betrayal, not every atrocity. Sansa, voice low, wondered, is that truly better? Another lie? Another forced forgetting? Or partial telling? Bran closed his eyes. We must do what we can, lest the cost be too great. They all weighed that compromise. In the end, necessity triumphed over principle. The realm would not stand a chance against the White Walkers if it remained fractured and oblivious to the dangers of the long night. They would need the broad knowledge, dragonglass, Valyrian steel, the importance of unity, the memory of how the dead were once defeated. But perhaps they did not need to recall the Red Wedding, the Mad King's horrors, or the savage politics that had devoured Westeros. If the people did not recall all the betrayals, maybe they would not fear them repeating. Perhaps that ignorance was the realm's best shield against tearing itself apart a second time. The next step was to decide how to spread the partial memory. Bran could not personally touch every mind, but the Weirwood network spanned the continent. The same method he had used to wipe memories could, in theory, be reversed. Over weeks of deliberation, the newly informed small council debated the best approach. Should they do it all at once, as Bran had done before? Or gradually, region by region, to ensure no panic ensued? Brienne favored a gradual approach so that each lord or community, some form of leadership had inevitably reemerged, could be guided by an envoy. Tyrion agreed, pointing out that a sudden flood of partial memories might cause havoc if no one explained it. Davos suggested sending trusted messengers to each region first, to clarify what was coming. Sansa proposed forging a new vow or set of principles that the realm's new communities could agree upon, ensuring they pledged unity in the face of the undead threat before or immediately after receiving the memories. Jon offered to return north, to scout the threat more closely and learn if the White Walkers truly gathered an army or if these sightings were scattered remnants. He would set up watchpoints along the remains of the wall, rallying the Northerners, most of whom, ironically, had no recollection of the vows their ancestors swore. He wanted to guide them with clear purpose. The memories of the last great war were fresh in Jon's mind, his mind that had been newly restored to him. He couldn't rest until he knew how imminent the danger was. The group agreed. In the end, they formed a plan. Tyrion would lead an envoy west, toward the Westerlands, the Reach, and the Riverlands, bridging new communities with old knowledge. Davos and Sansa would travel south and east, visiting the Stormlands, Dorne, perhaps even the Vale, and making certain that each region was prepared for the partial memory restoration. Brienne would remain in King's Landing to guard Bran and orchestrate the realm's general readiness. Messengers would ride out, carrying word that a new revelation was coming, a memory of an old war that threatened to happen again. Over time, they would link it to the Weirwoods in each region, allowing Bran's power to flow through them, seeding the necessary knowledge in hearts and minds. And so, one morning, under the watchful eye of a city that still largely remembered nothing, a small procession of wagons, knights, and supplies departed King's Landing in 3 different directions. Tyrion, Podrick, and a handful of volunteers took the western road. Davos, Sansa, and several others headed toward the Dornish marches. Jon, on horseback with his northern retinue, set off along the King's Road, past the Neck and into the cold expanses. Meanwhile, Brienne remained at the Red Keep, patrolling the city walls and preparing local recruits to serve as a central muster if war came. The city folk looked on, curious, uncertain why these journeys were so solemn, so urgent. They heard rumors of a gathering threat, but no one understood the gravity unless they had been in the Godswood that night of revelation. Still, they trusted their guides, for these were the same leaders who had nurtured the city into a peaceful new life. Over the coming weeks, Bran used the Weirwood in King's Landing as a hub, reaching out through the roots of the old gods to sense the presence of other Weirwoods. Many had been cut down in the south long ago, but some pockets remained. Hidden groves, old castle godswoods, even newly planted saplings that had grown enough to link with the ancient network. Through them, he could glimpse each region, see how the envoys fared, and prepare for the partial restoration. He tried to calm his nerves by reminding himself that they had no other option if the threat was real. Each night, he received glimpses of the north through Raven's eyes, seeing Jon's progress. Snow had already started to fall there, and the chill winds carried an unsettling hush. In the west, Tyrion and Podrick reached the outskirts of Lannisport. Once a thriving hub of the Westerlands, it was now a smaller settlement. The mines that had once brought the Lannisters fame and wealth lay half abandoned. People lived off simpler trades, farming, fishing, weaving. They recognized Tyrion only as a traveler in need of lodging, but they respected the calm authority he exuded. As he walked the worn streets of Lannisport, memories swirled. He recalled the grand days of House Lannister's wealth, the cunning of Tywin, the vanities of Cersei, the tarnished honor of Jaime. None of these people remembered that lineage. They only knew gold was sometimes found in the hills, but hardly enough to sustain them. The local leader, an older woman with a slight limp, received Tyrion's party with polite curiosity. She called herself Randa, said she had always lived in the area, tending goats. She knew the word Lannisport, but not why it was named that or who the Lannisters had been. That evening, around a large communal fire, Tyrion explained that a threat loomed, a threat from the far north. He spoke in the new language, careful to evoke images of unity. "We must come together, fight cold monsters," he said. The crowd looked doubtful, uneasy. Their daily struggles involved goat herding and hauling small loads of or from abandoned mines, not mythical ice creatures. Tyrion then pointed to the few stunted weirwood saplings he had found on the outskirts of Lannisport. Someone had apparently planted them a few years back, likely out of devotion to the old gods or simple aesthetic. "Through them," he said, "you will see the truth. You will remember old war. But only that war, not all else." Randa and the others glanced at each other, uncertain. The entire proposal sounded like madness. And yet Tyrion's sincerity, his mixture of compassion and urgency, swayed them. He explained that in a matter of days, when word arrived from King's Landing, Bran would reach out through those saplings and share the needed memories. Randa hesitated. "Why not everything?" she asked. "Why hide other memories?" Tyrion pressed his lips together. "Because that can bring old grudges, old hatreds. We want to stay free of that." The notion that he, Tyrion Lannister, was advocating a partial truth might have once struck him as hypocritical or manipulative, but the weight of everything he'd seen changed his perspective. He had known what full memory could do. Now he also knew what total forgetting could do. A middle path was their best hope. The next morning, the people of Lannisport gathered by those weirwood saplings, solemnly waiting. Tyrion stood among them, breathing in the crisp morning air, feeling the connection to Bran, an almost imperceptible tug in his consciousness. Bran, from far in the east, in King's Landing's Godswood, reached out. A hush descended on the small crowd as they felt an odd stirring in their minds. Their eyes glazed with distant focus, as though they glimpsed visions. Then a ripple of alarm, sorrow, resolve swept through them. Some cried out, stepping back from the trees, while others clutched their neighbors' arms. Tyrion felt it too, a second wave of memory, but only the portion concerning the Great War against the Night King. He recalled winter storms lashing the armies of the living, the lines of wights advancing, the Night King astride his undead dragon, the last stand in Winterfell's courtyard, Arya's fatal strike, and the euphoria of victory. He had known it all before, but the partial restoration here was aimed at these unknowing folk. They now saw glimpses of that war. The threat of the dead, the unity of houses, how the living had banded together despite old enmities. When it ended, Randa looked dazed. "I saw White Walkers," she murmured, using the old phrase Tyrion had taught them. "An army of dead. So many dead." Others chimed in, describing skeletons, frosty air, a monstrous being with a crown of ice. Their hearts hammered. Yet they also recalled how the living overcame that foe by standing shoulder to shoulder, forging alliances. Everyone felt exhausted, as if they had personally fought in that war. In a sense, they had Bran's magic granted them a collective memory of it. They recalled fear, desperation, and finally triumph. "What do we do now?" asked a bearded man, voice trembling. "Will that happen again?" Tyrion answered gently, "It might. We must unite as before. We must prepare." He spread his arms, turning to the wide crowd, scanning their faces. "We have time. Not much, but enough if we stand together." Randa, tears still on her cheeks, nodded firmly. "We will. We do not want that terror again." Similar scenes played out across the realm. Davos and Sansa traveled into Dorne, where they found a region of quiet orchard lovers and water gardeners. Beneath bright sun, the pair introduced the concept of a northern threat, which earned raised eyebrows in the southern heat. But once the partial memories were shared through old weirwood stumps in the water gardens, the Dornish recalled the terror of the Night King's invasion and how they had once contributed troops to the living's cause. Even that partial recollection stirred old passions. They felt pride that Dorne had stood against the undead, pride in their spears and cunning. Yet they did not recall the brutal feuds with the Reach or the centuries of near independence. Sansa noted that each region's reaction was colored by the new, simpler identities they had formed in the years of amnesia, but also by the innate qualities that had always set them apart. Davos carefully explained that Dorne's swords and spears would again be needed, not in conquest, but in defense of all Westeros. The local leadership, an informal council that met under date palms, debated but ultimately agreed. The memory of unstoppable whites was enough to stifle any thought of refusing. There was no talk of old kings or lords. They simply recognized that working with the rest of the land was necessary to avert a second long night. In the Vale, matters were similar. A new generation of Highlanders and Valley folk lived peacefully, rarely venturing beyond the Ares high roads. They practiced farming on terraced slopes, forging communal rules. But once they received the partial memory, the Ares Guardians decided to send a contingent of warriors to the protective cause. The shared recollection that the Vale had once marched to Winterfell's aid under Sansa's and Jon's pleas resonated, forging an echo of that unity. South and west, region by region, the partial memory took root. The knowledge of the old war, how it was fought, how the undead were vulnerable to dragonglass and Valyrian steel, how the living triumphed by forging alliances, spread like seeds in spring. The ephemeral horrors of that memory, as well as the sense of mortal peril, impelled each pocket of the realm to rally. Soon, the roads bustled with movement. Volunteers from the Reach traveled north, carrying wagons of grain and produce to feed potential armies. Smiths in the Stormlands began forging steel weapons. Some experimental attempts to replicate Valyrian forging techniques gleaned from half-remembered glimpses. In many places, small caches of dragonglass were discovered, shards left from the war or mined from Dragonstone's caverns. Once forgotten, now prized again. Still, the old grudges remained buried, for the partial memory contained only the Great War. People had no recollection of the centuries of Targaryen rule, the rebellion of Robert, or the feuds of Lannisters and Starks. They recalled only that, once, a dire threat had loomed, and they overcame it by uniting. It was a precarious balance, but it worked. Bran, linking through the Weirwoods, saw the realm mobilizing in a way that mirrored the final days before the Night King's assault, but with none of the internal factional friction that had so often hampered the living. He sensed hope. Meanwhile, far to the north, Jon Snow rode through Winterfell's gates. Winterfell had changed little in the memoryless years. Its thick walls stood, half-repaired, half-ancient, offering warmth against the biting winds. Sansa had once left a small leadership structure in place. Men and women who had discovered how to manage the castle's resources. They recognized Jon from his previous visits, greeted him politely but without any sense of fealty. Now, with Jon's full memories restored, he looked upon these old stones with a wave of nostalgia and pain. Ghosts of the past haunted every courtyard corner. Ned's stern gaze, Robb's laughter, Arya's quick steps, Rickon's playful mischief, his own uncertain place among them. Gathering the small folk in the courtyard, Jon explained what was coming. The realm remembers an old war. We must prepare for threat from the north. We do not know the size or time, but we must be ready. Then, at Jon's instruction, a pair of weirwood trees growing in the Godswood of Winterfell, the same ancient trunk with a carved face and a young sapling that had sprouted in recent years, transmitted the partial memory to the crowd. The hush was profound as the watchers felt the wave of recollection. Some cried out, glimpsing the long night and the undead hordes. They saw the courtyard of Winterfell filled with the living, desperately holding the walls, saw Jon leading the charge, saw dragons overhead, saw Arya's final dagger strike in the Godswood. When the vision faded, the people of Winterfell blinked, shaking off the dreamlike state. A man who had served as a steward rubbed his eyes. We fought here. The dead were real, he muttered, voice trembling. Suddenly these stones felt all too familiar. A woman with wind-chapped cheeks dropped to a knee, not in fealty but in sheer shock at the enormity of what she'd seen. Jon stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. We must fight again if needed. The threat stirs. He tried to keep his voice calm, though part of him roiled in anxiety, wondering what would happen if the White Walkers truly mounted another assault. They had no dragons this time, no Daenerys, no Targaryen might, though in truth the dragons had been nearly lost by the final war anyway. They relied on the realm's unity, the old alliances, and the single advantage of partial memory that he and Bran were offering. The days that followed saw Winterfell become a rallying point for northern communities. Word spread to the Last Hearth, to Carhold, to Deepwood Motte, to White Harbor. In each place, the local populations received the partial memory through weirwood contact. Their shock turned to grim determination as they recalled how the North had nearly fallen under an endless tide of the dead. The new Northmen, though they lacked the bitterness and ancient grudges that once defined so many houses, retained the same hardy resolve that had always characterized them. They looked to Jon for leadership. When he roamed the training yard, men and women alike approached him to volunteer. Some recognized him as the figure they'd seen in the shared vision, a leader who had stood against the darkness. They had no memory of his Targaryen heritage or the complexities of his parentage, only an image of him as a steadfast protector. By the onset of midwinter, the realm was stirring with a focus unseen since the momentous days of the last war against the dead. From Dorne to the Wall, small caravans of reinforcements traveled north, braving cold roads and uncertain passes. Blacksmiths hammered out spears and arrowheads from obsidian. Scouts patrolled the Gift and the lands beyond, seeking any sign of the enemy. And yet, from Bran's vantage in King's Landing, he sensed stillness. The glimpses he caught through ravens in the far north suggested scattered whites, elusive shapes in the snow, but not a full-scale army. Some watchers reported footprints or ominous sightings, but there was no sign of the Night King or another death incarnate. Perhaps it was only leftover pockets of undead, aimlessly wandering. When word of that ambiguity reached the realm, many breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Maybe the danger was not so dire. Yet the partial memory weighed on them. Those images of a catastrophic war could not be ignored. The realm, for the first time in its new era, mobilized in a pseudo-military stance, forming improvised regiments and supply lines. Tyrion in the west and Davos in the south coordinated with Brienne in King's Landing to ensure no one starved and no single region was overburdened. Sansa, traveling widely, used her knack for diplomacy to ensure every new community remained cooperative. The illusions of kings and lords still did not exist, but a sense of pan-Westerosi unity was blossoming in their place. In a bittersweet way, this was the very outcome Bran had once hoped for. A realm united without the shackles of the old lines. If it took the partial memory of a great threat to accomplish that, so be it. But not everyone was content. A portion of the Seekers, those who had either not been included in the partial memory plan or who had recognized the gaps, grew suspicious. They saw that the realm was receiving curated recollections, only the war with the dead, none of the rest. They noticed that the memories conveniently omitted the betrayals, the civil wars, the house rivalries. Indeed, if ever a piece of the old grudges surfaced by accident, Bran and the council quietly repressed it. That led some Seekers to claim that a new tyranny of ignorance was forming. They whispered that if the realm was strong enough to face the White Walkers, it should also be strong enough to confront the truth of its entire history. Why hide the rest? One of these seekers, a wiry man named Mailer, arrived in King's Landing with half a dozen followers, demanding an audience with Brienne and the newly formed city council. Mailer had found fragments of old documents referencing the Targaryen dynasty, the Baratheon rebellion, and the War of the Five Kings. He confronted Brienne outside the throne room, brandishing these scraps. "Look here," he insisted, voice carrying across the corridors. "These talk of other wars, of mad rulers, of houses locked in bloodshed. Why withhold them from us? If we are to be truly free, we must know the mistakes of the past." Brienne, calm but firm, replied that the realm was better off not reliving those horrors in detail. "We have unity now," she said, speaking in the simpler tongue they all used. "Too many old feuds would break that." Mailer's eyes flashed. "You fear the truth? You treat us as children. If we cannot face what once was, how can we be sure we will not repeat it?" A small crowd gathered. Some murmured agreement with Mailer, others frowned. It was the essential debate that had plagued Bran's conscience since the day he cast the Great Forgetting spell. Even Brienne, fully remembering the devastation of those civil wars, could see Mailer's point. Did not ignorance pose its own dangers? If a single charismatic figure discovered the truth and manipulated it, could they not coerce thousands into repeating the same tragedies? Brienne inhaled. "I understand, but the realm stands on a knife's edge. We face possible war with the undead. Dividing ourselves with old rancors would be disastrous." Mailer refused to yield. "Then at least do not lie. Let the people decide." He raised his voice for the onlookers. "We are not slaves. We have the right to remember all, not just the convenient parts." Tension crackled in the air. Brienne looked to the crowd, uncertain. She had never been a politician. She was a knight who served honor. But the very institution of knighthood was tied to a history that most had forgotten. With a resigned sigh, she said, "I will bring you before Bran, but do not cause trouble while you wait. We are all needed in the fight that may come." Mailer nodded stiffly, reining in his anger, but the fervor in his eyes did not wane. When Brienne relayed the incident to Bran that evening in the Godswood, the king, though no one really used that title these days, nodded unsurprised. "The realm grows curious," he said quietly. "Perhaps the time comes for full memory, or not." Brienne's voice was soft, imploring. "Can the realm handle it? We are no longer the same people who tore ourselves apart for a throne. We might not repeat those mistakes." Bran glanced at her, eyes distant as if seeing far beyond. Knowledge of old horrors might teach caution, or might resurrect ambition. They weighed the possibilities. The partial memory had served to unite Westeros against the threat of the dead, but the realm was already forging new ways of life that were freer than the feudal structure. If they suddenly recalled the proud banners and the elaborate claims of House Lannister, House Tyrell, House Martell, House Tully, House Stark, House Greyjoy, House Arryn, House Baratheon, would the leaders or heirs of those lines be tempted to reassert old rights? Some might, yet perhaps an equal number would reject that, seeing that this new realm had flourished without rigid hierarchies. The risk was enormous. Mailer and his followers pressed the point. They rallied more seekers, appealing to the realm's sense of justice. "The council is hiding the full past. They treat you as children. Demand the entire truth." Rumors circulated, bringing uncertain glances. Some worried that if there were more secrets, they might be equally vital to ensuring Westeros' survival. A swirl of new tension began to form, nothing like the old civil strife, but an undercurrent that threatened the fragile harmony. As winter deepened, it became clear that a decision had to be made. Tyrion returned from the west with news that the partial memory was working well for the purposes of mobilization. But talk of the council's censorship spread. Davos and Sansa arrived from the south with similar stories. People demanded to know if a dark past was being kept from them and if that knowledge could harm or help them in the future. Bran gathered the council, now consisting of Tyrion, Sansa, Davos, Brienne, Podrick, and a handful of newly minted regional representatives who had led the partial memory efforts. They convened in the throne room at King's Landing. Though the Iron Throne remained unoccupied, an intimidating relic of a time most still did not recall. The council debated into the night, voices rising in an echo of old disputes. Did the realm deserve full history? Would it tear them apart or save them from repeated mistakes? Tyrion observed that they had become something akin to guardians of the realm's knowledge, akin to the old maesters, but that came with a responsibility. In truth, he said, we stand at a crossroads, no different than all those centuries ago when men vied for the throne. The question now is not who sits on a pile of swords, but whether knowledge is locked away or shared. We must decide if we truly trust the people of Westeros. Sansa, remembering her own harrowing past, closed her eyes and spoke quietly. I was once a pawn in the Game of Thrones. I suffered because those in power hid truths from me. If we do that now, are we any different? Brienne's gauntlet hands rested on the pommel of her sword. I fear the wars that might come, she admitted, but I cannot deny that ignorance is a different kind of danger. Davos, sitting with hands folded, offered a grim half-smile. At least the folk of Westeros these days aren't used to blood feuds. They've known peace. Might that not give them a better foundation to learn the past without repeating its mistakes? Tyrion raised an eyebrow. There will always be unscrupulous or ambitious people. But if enough of us stand for cooperation, perhaps they won't find the foothold they once did. Across the room, a Dornish representative with partial memory of the Great War and no memory of old Martell feuds, spoke up. We in Dorne have no interest in kneeling to any old house, nor do we want to fight them. We are content with how things are. If some name claims a right to rule us, they will find no support among us. Various nods echoed around the table. That might be a common sentiment. People comfortable in their new local structures would not necessarily surrender to a resurrected house. Then again, a charismatic leader might spin the history into a compelling narrative, claiming an ancestral right or reviving xenophobic attitudes. So many variables. In the end, after hours of discussion, Bran's soft voice drew them to a conclusion. We must trust the realm. Full memory, not forced, but offered. Those who wish can come to Weirwoods, learn all. Others need not. And we must be ready to keep peace if old grudges return. The council concurred. It was the only balanced path. They would not forcibly restore every mind, as they had done with the war memory. Instead, they would make the knowledge available to those who sought it, so no one could accuse them of hiding the truth. The Weirwoods across Westeros would serve as living archives. Any who truly wished to learn the entire tapestry of the realm's history, from the Age of Heroes to the last Targaryen War, could request a guided ceremony, overseen by one who already remembered. That caretaker would ensure the individual understood the gravity of the knowledge they were receiving. Then, with Bran's distant but constant presence, the Weirwood would grant them the full memory. A solemn vow would be required, to use this knowledge to protect, not to dominate. Mailer and the Seekers were satisfied when they heard the plan, though some demanded immediate universal restoration. Bran refused. Tyrion explained that forcing the entire realm to recall every atrocity without preparation would risk massive unrest. Far better to let each adult make a choice, with some measure of caution. Mailer grudgingly accepted this compromise, seeing it as a step toward what he called the realm's maturity. Word spread swiftly. Across Westeros, the same Weirwoods that had delivered the partial memory were now declared open for any who wished the full truth. Some flocked to them, hungry to know the entire tapestry. Others hesitated, content to remain free of the shadows of old feuds. A few were fearful of the mental onslaught. The partial memory had been jarring enough. This was likely to be far more intense, as it encompassed all the heartbreak, all the betrayals, all the strife that had racked Westeros for centuries. Bran, from the Godswood at King's Landing, braced himself. He would be the conduit for all that knowledge, the final gatekeeper. He had lived with the realm's entire memory for years, and it had nearly crushed him at times. Now, the realm would share in that burden. Slowly, methodically, the ceremonies began. In the Crownlands, Brienne and Davos supervised a small group each dawn. Tyrion in the west oversaw the process at each Weirwood sapling or ancient trunk. Sansa in the north did likewise. They ensured that those who came understood the vow to preserve peace. Then Bran gently opened the floodgates of history, weaving the story into their minds as best he could, all within moments that felt like centuries to the recipients. Wars, betrayals, alliances, the forging of the Iron Throne, the Targaryen dragons, Robert's rebellion, the War of Five Kings, Cersei's reign, Daenerys' rise and fall, an endless cascade. Some people emerged from the ritual weeping, horrified at the blood-soaked legacy of the land they walked. Others were incensed at the outrages once committed by rival houses. But in each case, they were greeted by community leaders who reminded them, "That was then, this is now. We are new people living in a realm that has moved on. Let us not reignite war over ghosts of ancestors." The majority, humbled by the scale of the tragedies, realized that resurrecting them for petty vengeance would only doom the realm anew. A few troublemakers, inevitably, tried to stir up local resentments, proclaiming themselves rightful lords or heirs. Yet, with no institutional support or ingrained feudal loyalty to rally, such calls found little traction. The populace had tasted years of simpler peace. They had forged new bonds free of archaic hierarchies. In many villages and towns, newly informed individuals took it upon themselves to speak to their neighbors, urging them to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Some pressed for new forms of governance that combined the best of old knowledge, laws, principles of inheritance, or trade agreements, with the new era's communal approach. A lively debate spread across the realm. How best to structure society so that tyranny and endless succession wars would never return. The conversation was messy, diverse, and occasionally heated, but it did not descend into open violence. People recognized that the real threat still loomed in the north, so petty squabbling over who might be the new king or lord seemed pointless. Jon Snow, from Winterfell, oversaw a wave of full memory restorations among the Northerners who volunteered. He watched them reel under the knowledge that House Stark had once been the guardians of the North, proud and unyielding, that the Boltons had committed atrocities, that the Umbers and Karstarks had clashed with the crown. The newly informed gasped at the Red Wedding. Some howled in grief at the death of Robb Stark, outraged at the Freys and the Lannisters. But then they looked around them, saw no Freys remaining as lords, saw Lannisters in the west who had embraced a new era, and realized that revenge would serve no purpose. Eventually, one by one, they knelt before the crypts of Winterfell, paying respect to the memory of Ned, Catelyn, Robb, and those who suffered. They rose with a vow to keep the North united, not in hatred, but in vigilance for the threat beyond the wall. Jon found himself at the heart of these renewed feelings, a living link to the Stark line. Even if he was a Targaryen by blood, few pressed that point, for they saw in him the quiet loyalty to the North. A sense of cautious optimism took hold. The realm was finally facing its entire past, the good and the ill. Yet the dire consequences so many had feared did not erupt. There were scattered incidents, some small group in the Westerlands raising a lion banner, proclaiming themselves true Lannisters, only to be met with shrugs by the local population, who preferred simpler governance. A self-styled descendant of House Targaryen surfaced near Dragonstone, though the castle was largely empty. He tried to gather followers, but only a handful answered. The era of dragons and conquest was gone, replaced by a more egalitarian mindset. The people simply weren't interested in kneeling to a name they had lived without for years. The realm's greatest safeguard was the fact that no living memory of fealty had shaped these new generations. They might recall the concept of lords and kings from the Weirwood vision, but they had not grown up believing in it. That difference was everything. And so, as the winter deepened and the nights grew longer, Westeros found itself in a state of unprecedented honesty. The truth was there for any who wanted it, but the new life they had built without the weight of history remained a viable alternative. Some opted out of the full memory, not wanting the burden of old nightmares. Others accepted it, vowing never to let those horrors come again. Gradually, the realm moved on. People used the knowledge gleaned, like advanced agriculture or engineering techniques once lost in the turmoil, to improve their towns. Libraries were re-established. A new generation of maesters emerged, not beholden to the old citadel but forging a new order dedicated to open education. The faith of the Seven was revived in some parts, the old gods revered in others, the drowned god to the Ironborn who lived along the coasts. But none of these faiths claimed the absolute dominance they once had. No single religion sought to crush the others, for in these years of forgetting and partial remembering, tolerance had become ingrained. Meanwhile, the North stood watch. Jon Snow and his scouts ventured beyond the wall multiple times, searching for signs of a massing undead army. Each time, they found only scattered remnants, small pockets of wights, a handful of pale walkers that dissolved upon being struck with dragonglass. It seemed that the Night King had truly been the linchpin of that dark host. Without him, the threat might remain localized and weak. Over time, these pockets could be hunted down, destroyed, ensuring the realm's safety. The cold lingered, but not unnaturally so. No endless winter enveloped them. Returning from one such patrol, Jon rode into Winterfell with the head of a broken wight, evidence that the threat was real but contained. He found Tormund Giantsbane, who had also regained partial memory, living with other free folk near the abandoned castles of the Night's Watch, and they spoke of how their people would keep the watch in the true sense, ensuring no reemergence of a White Walker menace. The free folk, no longer adversaries of the realm, were recognized as equals. They had their own communities beyond the wall, coming south sometimes to trade for goods. Tormund's laughter echoed off the frosty courtyard stones when Jon told him how men in the south marveled at the idea of living so far beyond civilization. Days later, Jon met Sansa in the Great Hall of Winterfell. She had returned from an extended journey through the Vale and the Riverlands, ensuring the memory ceremonies were proceeding smoothly. They embraced, a gesture of sibling closeness. Then they spoke in hushed tones by the fire. The memories had restored to them their childhood bond, along with all the heartbreak in between. Yet they also had the new closeness forged by the amnesiac years. They were no longer two wary survivors of war, but leaders of a realm that had transcended that war. "How fares the Vale?" Jon asked, settling into a simple wooden chair. Sansa sat across from him. "Strangely well," she said with a soft smile. They remembered House Arryn, yes, but no one was eager to re-establish a lordship. Most are content with the local councils. Some older folk, once they got the full memory, wept at how House Arryn died out with little Robert. There was sorrow, but not vengeance. They prefer the quiet life they've built. Jon nodded. Seems that's the pattern everywhere. The memory is heavy, but it hasn't incited them to war or conquest. Maybe we truly have grown as a people. Sansa reached over and squeezed Jon's hand. It's the old dream, isn't it? A united realm that doesn't tear itself apart. We nearly destroyed ourselves the last time. Now we're forging a unity based on choice. She gazed into the fire, recalling the orphans, the refugees, the chaos that once engulfed kings landing under a mad queen's dragonfire. "We lost so much," she whispered, "but perhaps we gained a second chance." Jon glanced at her thoughtfully. "What of the future, then? We have no Iron Throne, no single monarch. Do we need one?" Sansa's gaze flicked back to him, the flicker of a smile ghosting her lips. "No, I don't think so. Let the realm govern itself in each region, with a council that meets as needed. We have trade, we have communication, we have the means to defend ourselves if needed. What could a king do for us that we cannot do ourselves?" Jon considered that, remembering how he had once reluctantly worn the crown of the king in the north, how he had set it aside for the greater good. Bran is still considered, what exactly? Sansa shrugged gently. He's more a guardian than a king, a keeper of memories, if you like. People respect him, but they don't clamor for him to rule them. They have their own councils, and he's content with that. Silence stretched between them, warm and reflective. Jon listened to the crackle of the fire. At length, he said, "I might remain here in Winterfell, help hold the North together. We do need some structure, even if we don't call it a monarchy. People look to us. The name Stark still means something, memory or no." Sansa nodded. "Yes, they do look to us. We can guide them, not as overlords, but as stewards of the North, I suppose." Jon nodded slowly. That sounds right. He glanced at the window, where snow flurries drifted against the gray sky. Do you ever think of Arya out there somewhere? A pang crossed Sansa's face. I do. She was always restless. If the day comes that she wants the full memory, she knows where to find us. They shared a moment of quiet affection for their scattered family, then parted ways to their duties. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Bran continued his watch. People came and went from the Godswood, some seeking the partial memory of the Great War, some seeking the fuller tapestry. He guided them all, weaving in caution, love, and a message of unity. Not all accepted it wholeheartedly. Some left the vision with bitterness or ambition burning in their hearts. But they found few who shared that ambition, for the realm's cultural landscape had shifted. The massive apparatus of feudal loyalty and tradition simply did not exist anymore. Over time, even the discontent realized they had more to gain from peaceful cooperation. Seasons passed in this manner. The threat in the north gradually diminished as hunts destroyed white nests. A new generation was born, one that had grown up in a realm that recognized the horrors of the past but chose to forge a simpler path. Freed from the burdens of inheritance and vendetta, these children learned from shared memory but did not let it shackle them. They traveled more freely. Roads that once bristled with tolls and petty lords were open, with watchposts manned by local volunteers. Knowledge spread swiftly. Innovations in farming and building circulated. Old trade routes flourished. People lived under local governance that they could influence directly, and if a dispute arose, the new councils or traveling arbiters helped settle it. In time, the partial memory of the Great War became almost a legend retold at gatherings, not to stoke fear but to remind them that unity had once saved them from unimaginable darkness. The full memory of Westeros's entire bloody history remained an option for anyone seeking deeper truth. Some took that path to learn cautionary lessons, others to research genealogies or old crafts. But the impetus for war was no longer there. The children of houses Lannister and Stark might find one another across the dinner table and think it perfectly normal to share bread instead of brandishing steel. Targaryen, Baratheon, Tyrell, these names were now half mythicized, belonging to a grand epic that the realm had consciously chosen not to resurrect. And always, Bran Stark remained in the Godswood at King's Landing, though sometimes he traveled in spirit, and occasionally he even journeyed in person, his attendants pushing his wheelchair along roads that had become safer than at any time in living memory. He watched the realm flourish, no longer burdened by the shackles of an endless cycle. He listened to the laughter of children who would never fear the tyranny of a mad monarch, saw the cooperative gatherings that fed the hungry and settled disputes. His own heart bore the sorrow of all that had been lost. He remembered those who had died in the wars, who had sacrificed everything. But that sorrow was tempered by the hope he saw in the faces of a realm forging a future unlike any it had known. In quiet moments, he thought of his father, Ned Stark, and how the man had always believed in honor, in doing what was right for the good of all. He believed Ned would approve of this new Westeros, where knowledge was not a weapon hoarded by the powerful, but a shared gift, where mercy tempered ambition, and where all had the power to shape their own destinies. And so, as a gentle spring dawn broke over King's Landing's walls, Bran sat beneath the heart tree, its red leaves rustling in the soft breeze. He closed his eyes, letting his mind drift across the land. He saw farmers at first light, guiding plows across fertile fields once ravaged by war. He saw a cluster of fisherfolk in the Reach, pushing small boats off a calm river. He saw blacksmiths in the Stormlands forging dragonglass arrowheads, still mindful of the undead threat that never fully vanished but no longer loomed as an apocalypse. He saw the wide roads carrying merchants from Dorne to the Vale. He saw the Eyrie perched high, no longer a fortress of seclusion but a refuge for travelers passing through the mountains. He saw the Citadel in Old Town, reformed by men and women who chose open scholarship over secret knowledge. He saw Winterfell, strong in the north, with Jon and Sansa guiding the people with quiet wisdom. He saw the free folk beyond the wall, living unharassed, while Tormund's hearty laughter filled the frosty air. It was not a perfect realm, no realm ever was. There were disputes, crimes, mistakes, tragedies. But it was a realm that, for the first time in living memory, and for the first time in the mind of the three-eyed raven, was not defined by the scars of endless war. It was a realm where men and women could choose to remember the old cruelties or let them lie, focusing on the future they shaped by their own hands. A realm where no single family or throne towered over all in tyranny, and no monstrous threat went unheeded. Bran opened his eyes, gazing at the carved face of the weirwood. In its silent visage, he saw the reflection of all that had been and all that might yet be. He took a slow breath, filling his lungs with the fresh morning air. The wind stirred the leaves overhead, no longer the hush of fearful reverence, but the gentle murmur of a land awakening to a hopeful dawn. He could still hear the echoes of the old world, roars of dragons, thunder of hooves, cries of battle, and he knew that legacy would never fully vanish from the tapestry of time. But those echoes were tempered by the quiet hum of daily life, the songs of farmers in the fields, the ring of hammers in new forges, and the laughter of children who would never fear the shadow of a mad king. For the first time, Westeros was living without the weight of its own brutal past crushing its present. It had walked through fire and ice, had forgotten itself, and then chosen to remember only as much as it needed to live wisely, not vengefully. Yes, Bran thought, letting his gaze travel across the city below, the realm was indeed free, truly free. At long last, the rain drummed against the leaves of the Red Keep's Godswood in steady, rhythmic taps. Night had fallen, and most of King's Landing lay still. Lanterns glowed dimly in windows across the city, but the grand torches on the outer walls had burned low, leaving only a faint halo atop each battlement. Beneath the heart tree, Bran Stark sat with his eyes closed, hands resting on the arms of his wheeled chair. He was breathing slowly, deeply, as though half asleep. Yet behind those heavy lids, his mind soared across Westeros, peering through the eyes of circling ravens, drifting into half-ruined keeps in the far west, or whispering through lonely forests in the neck. His gift as the three-eyed raven, once so burdensome, had become a quieter presence, a watchful guide for a realm that had long since moved past the tyranny of a single iron throne. Weeks had passed since the last wave of new petitioners arrived to receive their full memory from the Weirwoods. The initial rush of interest, people wanting to know all the hidden truths, had slowed. Some returned from that experience humbled and saddened, weighed by the knowledge of Westeros's old cruelties. Others rose from it with renewed hope, seeing that their new era was immeasurably better than the constant wars of the past. Even the staunchest seekers, those who had once denounced Bran for withholding memories, seemed satisfied that the realm now had open access to the truth. And yet not everything was as tranquil as it seemed. A tremor in the distant corners of the realm tugged at Bran's awareness, like a faint chord vibrating through the Weirwood network. He sensed new shapes stirring in the gloom, not the undead this time. Those remained scattered threats in the far north, systematically hunted down by watchful northerners and free folk. Instead, these shapes were human, flickers of ambition, subtle embers of greed or fervor that glowed in the hearts of scattered men and women. Even in a realm freed from ancient feuds, new seeds of strife could still sprout. Human nature could not be magically erased forever. Bran opened his eyes to the hush of the Godswood. Rain trickled along the white bark of the heart tree, gathering in droplets on the carved face. From behind him, the soft sound of footsteps intruded. He did not turn. He recognized the presence before she spoke. "Your Grace," said Brienne of Tarth in a subdued tone. She always slipped now and then, calling him by an honorific that held little meaning in this new realm, but old habits died hard. "I've come from the eastern gates. There is news." Bran's voice emerged quietly. "Tell me." She walked around to face him, lamplight dancing on her wet armor. The tall knight inclined her head, water droplets sliding off her broad shoulders. A band of travelers arrived from across the narrow sea. They call themselves emissaries of the New Guys Confederacy. They sailed into Blackwater Bay on 2 ships. They request an audience. Bran frowned slightly. During the realm's transformation, contact with Essos had been sporadic. Some traders still crossed the sea, but Westeros had mostly turned inward to rebuild. Now, it seemed that Essos was stirring once more. "They want trade?" he asked softly. Brienne shook her head. "I'm not certain. They speak in heavily accented common tongue. But from what I gathered, they're here to discuss. Well, the word they used was expansion. They're asking who rules. I explained that we have no single king. They looked puzzled, insisted on seeing the seat of power. Memories of the old world, when foreign envoys arrived at King's Landing to treat with the Targaryen court or the Baratheon regime, flickered in Bran's mind. Once, such delegations might have found themselves petitioning a monarch at the foot of the Iron Throne. Now, the Iron Throne was a silent relic, rarely approached. "They will be disappointed," Bran murmured. Brienne managed a small, dry smile. "No doubt, but we must greet them properly. They've already stirred interest among the city folk. Rumors say they're from the slaver cities. Some claim those places had new regimes rise after Daenerys Targaryen left them in chaos. Others suspect they're from beyond. And the travelers themselves speak of a confederacy of city-states along the Gulf of Grief, claiming they want alliances." Bran closed his eyes for a moment. The ghosts of Daenerys Targaryen's campaign in Essos were sharp in his memory, even if most of Westeros had never learned or had long since forgotten those details. He recalled how she had shattered the slave trade in Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, but the aftermath had been complicated. New powers would have arisen in that vacuum. "Show them courtesy," Bran said at length. "Give them rooms in the Red Keep. Arrange for them to meet with the city's council. I will speak with them, too, but I suspect we must also gather representatives from other parts of Westeros." "Yes," Brienne agreed. "They specifically asked about lords, or about a king or queen. They wouldn't believe me at first when I said we have no monarchy." Bran shifted in his chair. "Then let us show them what we are now. Perhaps they'll accept it, or perhaps they'll challenge it." Brienne studied him. "Do you foresee trouble?" His expression remained thoughtful, distant. "Men who come seeking expansion usually have some ambition behind them, but we'll see." He turned his gaze upward, letting the raindrops spatter on his cheeks. "Tell them I'll meet them tomorrow at midday, in the Great Hall. Summon whomever we trust to greet them. Tyrion if he's in the city, Davos, Sansa, or their delegates if they've returned from their travels. Let us see what the East wants from us." Brienne nodded. "As you will, She paused, flushing slightly. "As you will, Bran." He offered a faint smile. "Thank you, Sir Brienne." She left him there in the hush of the Godswood, the slow patter of rain fading behind her. Bran inhaled the damp air, mind stirring with old recollections of Essos. Visions gleamed from the swirling tapestry of the three-eyed raven's knowledge. The East was not free of turmoil. Slave trading might have been temporarily banished in some cities, but the institution could have resurrected under new names. Freedmen might have formed new power structures. War was always an inevitability on the other continent. What would they make of a Westeros that had cast off monarchy and was only now forging a new kind of unity? He closed his eyes again, letting the currents of the weirwood guide his awareness. The realm he had so carefully shepherded through amnesia, partial memory, and eventual acceptance was about to face its first major diplomatic test in nearly a decade. He could only hope that the new ways would hold. They arrived in twos and threes, come midday, into what had once been the throne room. Long ago, that space was a locus of dread, overshadowed by the molten swords of Aegon's conquest. In the years after the Great Forgetting, it became an open hall where the people of King's Landing held communal gatherings. The Iron Throne still stood at the far end, but it was rarely used. Its silhouette an archaic relic, half menacing, half tragic. Bran sat near the dais, not on the throne but beside it, his wheelchair positioned so that the entire hall could see him. The day was bright. The tall windows let in streams of sunlight that illuminated the dust motes swirling in the air. Behind Bran stood Brienne, resplendent in her white and silver armor, her hand resting on the hilt of Oathkeeper. To her left, Ser Podrick Payne, still youngish though more seasoned, stood with quiet vigilance. The city's council members were gathered along the sides. A few who had taken up the roles of trade ministers, local guard captains, or philanthropic leaders. No hereditary lords, those days were over, but still a variety of figures who shaped the city's governance. Tyrion Lannister was present, having recently returned from an excursion to the Westerlands. His hair was streaked with gray, and lines of age marked his face, but his wits remained keen, his mismatched eyes alert. He wore simple clothes, a dark tunic without sigils. Sansa Stark, traveling through the Crownlands at the time, had also arrived. She had changed since the days of war, carrying herself with quiet confidence, her auburn hair threaded with silver. Her presence always brought to mind Winterfell's old dignity, though these days such impressions were a matter of personal bearing, not a recognized house. She stood near Tyrion, exchanging murmured observations. At the appointed hour, an usher led the Associ delegates into the hall. There were 4 of them, wearing exotic robes of deep red and gold, embroidered with glyphs and stylized animals. They each had tanned or olive-hued skin, marking them as men and women of the East. 3 men, 1 woman. Their leader appeared to be a tall, imposing figure with intricately braided hair, rings glinting on every finger, and a regal bearing that might have fit a noble of Volantis or a magister of Pentos. They paused in confusion upon seeing no dais-filled retinue of nobility, no shining king or queen to greet them. The one with the braided hair stepped forward, glancing uncertainly at Bran, whose presence in a wheeled chair and plain clothes was hardly reminiscent of a king. Tyrion stepped forward, offering a short bow. "Welcome to King's Landing," he said in a clear voice. "I am Tyrion, a council member representing this city. This," he gestured politely toward Bran, "is Bran Stark, the closest we have to a realm's guardian." Bran dipped his head. "Greetings," he said quietly, measuring each delegate's expression. "We understand you sailed from the Gulf of Grief, from New Guise, is that correct?" The tall delegate gave a curt nod. "Yes, I am Sadion, High Minister of Commerce for the New Guise Confederacy. My companions," he gestured to the other 3, a woman in saffron robes, a middle-aged man wearing golden bracers, and a younger man with a small scroll case at his hip. "We have come to treat with the King of Westeros." His tone held a faint challenge, as if expecting to see a king. Tyrion spread his hands calmly. "We have no king. Our realm is governed by councils and local assemblies that gather when needed. Bran here is the spiritual and historic center." Tyrion spared a faint smile, but not a monarch. Sadion's mouth tightened. "We heard tales that Westeros once had a powerful monarchy, that it was nearly destroyed in a civil war, and that a boy king rose. You speak of a system of councils, but where is the true authority?" He flicked his gaze around, noting the banners that didn't exist, the guards who wore no single crest. Bran's voice remained soft. "Our authority is shared," he said. "We have no desire for a single ruler. If you seek someone to sign treaties or speak for all of Westeros, you'll find that each region makes its own choices, though we gather in common cause when necessary." The female delegate in saffron frowned. "We heard rumors that this land fell into chaos years ago. Now we find it seemingly stable, but we also find no clear lines of command. Are you telling us each region is autonomous?" Sansa stepped forward. "Yes," she said gently. "We coordinate for trade, defense, and large undertakings. But we do not bow to a single crown. It's proven more peaceful for us." Sadion's brow creased. Then with whom do we negotiate for exclusive rights? We come seeking an arrangement, an alliance by which we might establish enclaves of trade, perhaps to claim or purchase certain port lands. We are prepared to offer wealth, goods, and future considerations." Tyrion's eyes narrowed slightly. "Enclaves? And what precisely do you mean by claim? If you desire to set up embassies or trade outposts, that can be discussed with local councils, Old Town, Lannisport, White Harbor, even here in King's Landing. But no single body can sell you exclusive territory. That is not how we manage our land." Sadion's stare turned calculating. "Then your realm is disorganized indeed. Back east, We have found that cooperation among city-states thrives best when there is a recognized authority to broker deals. We had hoped Westeros, having recovered from war, had a strong leadership that could expedite matters. But if we must negotiate with each port city separately— He spread his hands in a show of exasperation. Tyrion gave a shrug. We can offer help in bridging those contacts, but we cannot sign away land or rights on anyone's behalf. That must be a local decision. You are welcome to approach them. Perhaps we can gather a larger council of regional envoys, if it helps expedite your negotiations. But do not expect an old-style monarchy to hand you treaties. Sadion's companions exchanged glances. The younger man with the scroll case whispered something in Sadion's ear. Then Sadion addressed the hall once more. "We have a second matter," he said, voice taking on a graver note. "The Confederacy is expanding its naval reach. We look for new alliances, but also to ensure no hostility. We understand Westeros once possessed formidable fleets, or so history suggests. If your realm is truly fractured, perhaps it is less of a threat or a less valuable partner." Bran's tone was mild but tinged with steel. "We are not fractured. We are unified in purpose but not under a single crown. If you doubt our ability to defend ourselves, you may find it unwise to test that assumption." Sadion's expression tightened. A flicker of irritation crept across his face. The Confederate delegates had expected to walk into a more conventional seat of power, demand or negotiate terms with a single sovereign, and move on. Instead, they found a realm that had no monarchy, a patchwork of councils, and a calm but firm refusal to be pinned down. The female delegate in saffron, her name as introduced was Paula, said curtly, "We propose establishing a secure zone along your southern coasts, near Dorne, where we might land our ships, store goods, and operate under our own laws. Are you telling us that we must speak to the Dornish communities individually?" Sansa gave a single nod. "Yes, you should. Dorne is historically independent-minded, and they currently govern themselves by local councils. Some might be open to your proposal. Some might not. I suggest you treat them with respect. They have no memory of subjugation, and they will not accept it now." The third delegate, the older man wearing golden bracers, frowned. "We do not mean subjugation, merely a protected enclave for our merchants. Laws of new guys within that enclave, so they can function with familiar regulations." There was an edge of practiced diplomacy in his tone, yet something in the notion, "our own laws," prickled the room. Tyrion's posture stiffened. "We do not allow foreign enclaves in which our people have no rights or oversight. If you want fair trade, you must abide by local laws. Westeros is not a host for extraterritorial oppression." Sadion's lips pressed into a thin line. "Oppression, you say? That is a strong word." Sansa spoke up, voice carefully poised. "We recall, at least some of us recall, what once transpired in Essos. Slavery, brutal punishments, warlike expansions. Daenerys Targaryen fought to end those practices. We do not want them creeping back in the form of enclaves on our shores. We respect trade, but we do not allow bondage or cruelty. Does your confederacy still practice forced servitude?" Sadion bristled. "We have a labor system. It is regulated. Many are indebted, you might say." He hesitated, noticing the darkening expressions in the Westerosi. "But we do not call it slavery anymore. We have reformed. Freedmen can work off debts over time, or sign contracts for labor. It is not the savage institution you recall from the age of the Dragon Queen." Bran watched them quietly. Tyrion let out a soft, scornful exhale. "A fancy rewording, perhaps. If you plan to import such a system here, you will find no agreement." Brienne, behind Bran's chair, stirred as if uncomfortable. The delegates noticed. Their leader, Sadion, held up a hand, striving for composure. "Let us not leap to conclusions. We come with an offer of trade, not to impose our ways. Perhaps we can find compromise. We have heard tales of your abundant farmland, we can bring spices, silks, exotic goods from the Jade Sea, from the further east. Are you truly so closed off that you would reject new prosperity? Tyrion's mouth twitched. We do not reject trade or prosperity. We welcome honest commerce. We only reject enclaves with foreign laws that might condone practices we consider abhorrent. If you can operate under local laws, where no man, woman, or child is forced into bondage, then you are free to do business. A silence fell. The tension in the hall was palpable. The Associ had hoped for quick, neat deals. The Westerosi, shaped by a new ethos of communal sovereignty, refused to cede ground. At length, Sadion forced a thin smile. Then perhaps we should discuss these matters in detail in smaller gatherings. You say we must speak to each region, so be it. But let us begin with King's Landing, yes? Let us see how we might open routes from this port to the east. Bran nodded calmly. Yes, we can begin there. We have a new trade wharf by the Blackwater, overseen by a local council of merchants. Tyrion can introduce you. You will find no single official to bribe for privileges, if that is your intention. He added in a mild tone that belied the sting of his words. Our system is more transparent. Sadion gave a tight laugh. Bribes? You wound me. We shall proceed in good faith. He looked around the hall, his gaze lingering on the Iron Throne. A flicker of curiosity crossed his features, as though he couldn't quite reconcile that monstrous seat of swords with this realm that claimed to have no king. Then he gave a stiff bow. Very well. We accept your invitation to stay and negotiate with local bodies. Let us see if your councils can truly reach decisions. We shall see if this realm is as unified as you claim. With that, the Associ delegates stepped back. A steward guided them out of the hall to their quarters in the Red Keep. As soon as the doors closed behind them, soft murmurs broke out among the Westerosi gathered near the dais. Brienne let out a breath she'd been holding, while Tyrion turned to Bran with concern etched on his face. That was interesting, Tyrion commented drily. They expected some grand monarchy. Now they're F.A. Said with the reality that every region sets its own terms. Sansa folded her arms, thoughtful. They might try to exploit any divisions they find. Our realm is cooperative, yes, but we are also quite decentralized. If they sense they can pit one region against another, one giving them enclaves in exchange for gold, for instance, they might try. Tyrion made a face. We'll need to be vigilant. We're new at managing foreign powers this way. We can't simply rely on a single queen or king's decree to hold them in check. But then again, that might be to our advantage. If they try to buy a region, the rest of the realm can stand up in protest. Our new solidarity might prove stronger than they suspect. Bran looked to Brienne. Have them watch discreetly, but do not harass them. They'll want to see how we conduct ourselves. Let them see that we are not naive, nor can we be bullied. Brienne nodded. I'll ensure it, and if they try something overtly hostile, we will respond swiftly. Sansa's gaze flicked to Bran. I might contact the North and the Vale, urging them to be prepared for these envoys or others who may follow. The same with Dorne. The delegates specifically mentioned a desire to land in Dorne. We need to warn them to keep watch for any attempt to establish enclaves under questionable practices. Do so, Bran said quietly. Over the next days, the delegates from New Guise explored King's Landing. They walked the streets, escorted by a small retinue of city guards and interpreters from the council. They marveled at the open-air markets, the lack of official toll booths, the public granaries established after years of communal rebuilding. They made offers to local merchants for the sale of spices, silks, pearls gleaned from the shallow coasts near Sithorios, items that dazzled many. Yet some of the older merchants, especially those who had regained the full memory of Westeros' savage history, recognized subtle manipulations at play, attempts to sow competition to stir rivalries. The delegates hinted that certain families or neighborhoods could grow wealthy if they allied with New Guise exclusively, sidelining other local councils. But the city folk, for the most part, had little interest in secret deals. Distrustful of foreign overlords, they insisted that any major arrangement pass through open council sessions. Sadion and Pala repeatedly tried to secure some corner of the city docks for private use, promising lavish payment in coin or trade goods. The city council refused, stating that the docks were publicly managed for all who docked there, with transparent fees used to maintain harbor facilities. By the end of the first week, frustration weighed on the Associ delegates. They discovered that in this new Westeros, bribery and backroom deals did not yield quick results. More than once, they mused aloud about traveling south to Dorne, hoping to find a more pliable region. Meanwhile, letters and riders were traveling across Westeros, alerting each region to the presence of these ambitious foreigners, and cautioning them to stand firm against demands for enclaves or extraterritorial rights. In Winterfell, Jon Snow read these letters, frowning at the notion that the East might be nosing around for a foothold. He recalled, with full memory, how foreign involvement had once spelled trouble for the Seven Kingdoms, even if that trouble sometimes came from bravos or lists, not guys. The free folk beyond the wall cared little for such matters, but the Northerners as a whole recognized the need to remain watchful. If the delegates ventured that far north, they would find an even colder reception. In the Vale, a local council convened in the Eyrie to discuss the same matter, deciding that any Associ delegates who arrived would be treated courteously but with strict conditions. The Vale had little need for Eastern luxuries, and no desire to open its high passes to unknown powers. White Harbor, a major port in the north, prepared to greet them if they arrived, ready with a set of fair trade guidelines that mirrored King's Landing's approach. One crisp morning, Sadion requested a private audience with Bran, claiming that the council sessions were too crowded and bureaucratic. Reluctantly, Bran agreed to meet him in the Godswood, with Brienne present for security. Paula came along as well, while the other two Associ delegates remained behind at their lodging. In the hush beneath the weirwood's red leaves, Sadion studied Bran with curiosity. "I have heard rumors about you," he said softly, glancing at the carved face in the white bark. "They say you are old beyond your years, a knower of secrets, that you once performed some great magic on this land. Is that true?" Bran regarded him calmly. "We overcame a dark period. I helped the realm forget its hatreds. We have since chosen to remember only the lessons we need. Now we stand as we are." Paula folded her arms. "Magic or not, you appear to hold some power, but you do not use it to rule. Why?" Bran considered his words carefully. Westeros nearly destroyed itself through wars of succession, envy, and vengeance. A single ruler could not halt the cycle, nor could memory of old grudges. In forgetting, we found a new path. If I used my gifts to seize power, I would become another tyrant. That is not our way. Sadion's eyes narrowed. Fascinating. In New Guise, we also had periods of turmoil, especially after the Dragon Queen ended slavery in Meereen. We found stability again through strong leadership, Council of Masters newly rebranded with checks on each other. Power must lie somewhere, or chaos reigns. Bran gently shook his head. There are other forms of order. Sadion nodded slowly, glancing around the quiet Godswood. "So I see. But what if we asked you to share your capabilities with us? A beneficial arrangement. Our confederacy has powers of its own. Wealth, fleets, alliances. We could help this land expand its reach, unify it more effectively, if you so desired." His tone turned sly. "You might become more than just a caretaker." Bran felt Brienne stiffen behind him. He remained calm. "I have no desire for that, nor do our people. We have chosen not to unify under a single crown." Sadion studied him, as if searching for a weakness. "But the world is large. You claim you overcame internal conflict, yet you remain an island, isolated. Others will come, if not us. Powers from the Jade Sea, from the Summer Islands, from the remnants of Volantis or Bravos. They might not be so polite. What will you do when faced with truly hostile expansion?" Bran gazed up at him, unblinking. "We will stand together, as we did against worse threats. This time we have no illusions dividing us." A long silence stretched. The wind rustled the leaves overhead. Finally, Paula let out a half-laugh. "You speak with such certainty. Perhaps you have some hidden strength. Or perhaps you are naive, the product of a realm that forgot war." I wonder if you are prepared for the cutthroat ways of the Eastern nations." Brienne stepped forward, voice measured. "We might have forgotten the old feuds, but we remember the lessons. If you come peacefully, we welcome you. If you come with subterfuge or aggression, we will unite as one. We have proven that unity is stronger than personal ambition." Sadian's mouth curved into a tight smile. "So you say, then we shall see how negotiations unfold. We have no wish for conflict, merely an advantageous position. We will not press the matter further, for now." He turned and led Paula away, leaving Bran and Brienne in the hush of the Godswood. Once they were gone, Brienne exhaled, her breath misting in the cool morning air. They might push again, somewhere else, somewhere they think they can find a foothold. Her gaze fell on Bran. "Do you foresee a threat that might rally them to arms?" Bran closed his eyes, letting his consciousness dip momentarily into the weirwood's swirling perspective. He sensed no immediate armies on Westeros' shores, only these small delegations from across the sea. But in Essos, far beyond, countless city-states jostled for advantage, and the old powers of slavery and conquest lurked in shadows. "We must remain watchful," he said softly. Within a fortnight, the delegates from New Guise announced their intention to travel south, heading to Dorne by ship. They would also stop at Old Town if welcome. Tyrion offered to accompany them part of the way, both to facilitate introductions and to ensure they did not attempt any underhanded tactics in an unsuspecting region. The Confederates accepted, albeit grudgingly, perhaps seeing an opportunity to glean more about the realm's internal workings by traveling with one of its key counselors. Before they departed, Bran met Tyrion in a small courtyard in the Red Keep. The sky was pale blue, a crisp breeze drifting up from Blackwater Bay. Tyrion was dressed for the journey. Sturdy boots, a traveling cloak of dark green. He was checking the straps on a mule that would carry some of his belongings, while a pair of city guards hovered nearby. Bran rolled up beside him, the wheels of his chair making a soft rumble. "They seem intent on establishing a foothold somewhere," Bran observed. "Be on your guard." Tyrion sighed. "I will. I don't doubt they'll try to buy or bargain their way into an exclusive arrangement in Dorne or Old Town. But Dorne has always been prickly about foreign powers. And Old Town is a new seat of scholarship. The reformed maesters and local councils there might see through any trick. Still, I'll keep watch." Bran inclined his head in gratitude. "I suspect they might test the waters and, if they fail, report back to their confederacy. We must prepare for the possibility that a larger fleet follows." Tyrion gave a wry half-smile. "We do not want war, especially not with some confederation of city-states that might be quite large. But we won't be subjugated either. I see a delicate dance ahead." "Yes," Bran said softly. Tyrion paused, glancing over at Bran with an unreadable expression. "You know, sometimes I wonder if you regret what you did wiping the realm's memory. We have a new, peaceful approach to governance, but it leaves us somewhat untested against external threats. Maybe the old Westeros, for all its cruelty, was also fierce in defending its borders." Bran's eyes clouded with memory. "Westeros is fierce enough. Unity does not mean weakness. We overcame the undead. We can stand against these confederates if needed." A short nod from Tyrion. "True enough. I suppose I worry that those east of the sea, with their long histories of realpolitik, might see us as naive." He exhaled. "But we'll show them otherwise." Bran raised a hand, and Tyrion clasped it briefly in farewell. The dwarf then pulled himself onto a horse with practiced difficulty, ignoring the old jokes he might once have told about his short stature. He had long grown used to riding. The Confederate delegates waited at the gate, their clothing bright in the morning sun. Guards accompanied them. As the party trotted out of King's Landing, townsfolk lining the streets eyed the foreigners with a mix of curiosity and wariness. The Associ returned the stares with aloofness, as though unimpressed by these council-governed peasants. Bran watched the procession until it vanished down the winding street. Then he turned and headed back to the Godswood, mind churning. Trouble might still be a ways off, but it was in the air. He could feel it, Sansa remained in King's Landing for another fortnight, helping the city's leadership draft guidelines for handling foreign envoys. She had a talent for clarity that made her invaluable in these negotiations. Through the new network of communication, riders, ravens, and occasionally Bran's own Green Seeing, various regions refined a shared stance. Any foreign visitors would be treated kindly, trade was welcome, but no enclaves or private law zones would be granted. Any attempt to circumvent local laws, especially relating to servitude, would be considered an act of aggression. Once those guidelines were settled, Sansa prepared to travel north again, back to Winterfell. The North had asked for her presence at a major gathering to discuss expanding farmland in the new gift. She left with a small retinue on horseback, promising Bran she'd return in a few months' time. As she departed, she spotted Mailer, the one-time leader of the Seekers who had agitated for full memory, lingering near a fountain in the Red Keep's courtyard. He had grown into a dedicated archivist in King's Landing, now that the realm had open knowledge of the old days. He gave her a polite wave, which she returned. She was glad to see how even the most vocal agitators of the past had found a place in the new order. With Sansa gone, Brienne stepped up her oversight of King's Landing's defenses. The City Watch, though small, was well-trained and carefully chosen from among volunteers. They patrolled the walls, ensuring no foreign vessel landed without notice. The harbor itself bustled with fishing boats and the occasional trading cog from Pentos or Bravos. These city-states had minimal dealings with Westeros in recent years, but they were not hostile. Most recognized that any attempt to conquer Westeros was foolhardy, especially after tales of how the realm had once mustered armies to repel the army of the dead. The name Three-Eyed Raven had spread in stories across the narrow sea, though few truly understood it. By the time Tyrion and the Confederate envoys reached Old Town, the leaves had turned red and gold, marking a crisp autumn in the south. The harbor at Old Town was dotted with ships from various free cities, their flags snapping in the brisk wind. The starry September rose in the distance, no longer quite as grand as it had been in the era of Highgarden's glory, but still impressive. The citadel gleamed with new additions, towers built with the help of donors from across Westeros, dedicated to open scholarship. Maesters, both old and young, robed in gray, bustled across courtyards where once only a select few studied. Now, knowledge was less restricted, though still structured. Tyrion accompanied Sadion, Pala, and the others on foot through Old Town's winding streets. Observers parted to let them pass, some bowing politely to Tyrion, more out of respect for his well-known role as an emissary than for any old house name. As they approached the citadel's main gates, they were greeted by a middle-aged woman in grayish robes, a chain of multiple metals draped across her shoulders. Copper for history, steel for warfare, gold for economics, among others. She had a serious face but warm eyes. "Tyrion," she said with a polite dip of her head. "Welcome back. I see you've brought guests." He introduced Sadion's delegation. "These are emissaries from the New Guys Confederacy. They wish to speak about trade, alliances, and so forth." The woman introduced herself as Maester Sorella. "The Citadel is open to all who seek knowledge. If you desire to speak with our councils regarding trade routes, please do. We coordinate with the local assembly of Old Town for commercial matters." She beckoned them inside, glancing curiously at their foreign garb. As they walked through the Citadel's grand halls, Sadion and Pala exchanged whispers. Walls lined with bookshelves, scribes working at desks, novices carrying scrolls. It was a hub of scholarship, but it lacked the stifling secrecy of the old citadel. Clusters of men and women with half-chains, or no chains at all, engaged in open debate about agriculture, medicine, engineering. A separate wing housed scribes copying volumes that would be sent to smaller libraries across Westeros, part of a realm-wide initiative to ensure knowledge was not hoarded. "We did not expect such openness," Sadion commented, eyeing the manuscripts. "Are you not wary that knowledge could be used against you?" Tyrion gave a slight shrug. "We found that hoarding knowledge only led to manipulation. Shared knowledge fosters trust and reduces the value of secrets." Pala arched an eyebrow. "An interesting philosophy. Where we come from, power is often measured by the secrets one holds." Tyrion's mouth curved in a dry smile. We used to think the same way here. They arrived in a side chamber where Old Town's local assembly convened. A group of around 10 people, merchants, maesters, fisherfolk representatives, skilled craft workers, who acted as a guiding council for city affairs. Chairs arranged in a semicircle greeted them. Tyrion made formal introductions, and then the assembly began. Sadion tried the same approach he had in King's Landing, promising exotic goods if Old Town would cede a portion of its docks for Guy's lawful usage, meaning their own system of governance. He assured them it would bring wealth, that it would be more efficient, and that local laborers could sign contract terms beneficial to both sides. The assembly was polite but firm. Their lead spokesperson, a master shipwright named Grommen, declared, "We welcome trade. We do not welcome enclaves or separate laws. If you wish to build warehouses or offices, you must abide by Old Town's rules. That means no indefinite labor contracts that tie workers in a form of servitude. No private armed guards patrolling outside local jurisdiction." Paula's temper flared. "Must you hamper us at every turn? We come offering prosperity. Yet your people's conditions are so rigid." Grommen shook his head. "Rigid or not, they are ours. If you can accept them, you'll find we are quite eager to exchange goods. But we will not cede sovereignty." Sadion's eyes took on a steely glint. He recognized the same stance here that he'd met in King's Landing. The entire realm had coalesced around the principle. No foreign enclaves. Tyrion, sitting off to the side, watched carefully. Though he wanted peace, he half hoped the Associ would finally grasp that Westeros was not for sale. In the end, after hours of discussion, the Confederates conceded that they would open a small trade house in Old Town under local law. They could hire local workers, subject to fair wages and no indefinite indenture. The assembly agreed in principle, provided the Confederates submit any disputes to an impartial local court. Papers were drawn up requiring signatures. Sadion and Paula, bristling with annoyance, wrote their names, presumably intending to see if they could find loopholes later. That evening, Tyrion strolled along Old Town's harbor with Grommen, the shipwright. They watched the sun setting over the Whispering Sound, painting the water in gold and orange. Tyrion clasped his hands behind his back. "Thank you for standing firm in the negotiations. We suspect they wanted something more akin to a colony." Grommen grunted. "They'll not find that here, nor in Dorne if they try the same. Word arrived from King's Landing telling us to watch for it. So we are prepared." Tyrion nodded. "They may move on soon, test other places. But it seems like they're running into the same wall of decentralized but unified refusal. It's a strange new world we've built," Grommen mused. "Decentralized, yet we band together. Perhaps that's our strength. In the old days, a cunning envoy might have bribed a single king or a single lord. Now, they'd have to bribe dozens of councils, which is far more complicated." Tyrion let out a short laugh. A formidable shield indeed. While Tyrion and the Confederates continued southward to Dorne, the air over the rest of Westeros took on the crispness of late autumn. In Winterfell, Jon Snow oversaw a gathering to plan farmland expansion in the New Gift, as Sansa had said. A mild approach to the coming winter gave the hope for a bountiful harvest next year, if they could prepare enough fields. The people of the north were still slowly increasing in number. Some families from the south migrated up to enjoy the new freedoms and open land. Jon found himself mediating disputes about resource allocation, who would get the most fertile tracts, who would be assigned to glean the forest edges, how to handle hunting rights. It was a far cry from the pitched battles he once fought. He sometimes caught himself smiling at the normalcy of these concerns. Still, he had not forgotten the presence of scattered, undead remnants beyond the wall. He kept a watchful guard in the far north, though no major threat had reared its head in months. Sansa arrived after her journey, greeted by cheers from local folk who respected her calm leadership and wise counsel. She joined Jon in a large hall warmed by braziers and new glass windows, a recent innovation from some southern crafters. Over a hearty meal, they discussed the letters from King's Landing about the Associ visitors. Sansa sipped hot cider. "They're trying to carve out enclaves for themselves. So far, they've failed." Tyrion accompanied them to Old Town, presumably next to Dorne, or the Stormlands, or who knows where. Jon nodded, leaning back. As long as the realm remains united in refusing enclaves, they can do little. The question is whether they'll eventually attempt force. They might have fleets, even armies, if they're so determined. Sansa's brow furrowed. Would they truly risk open war? A realm this large, even without a king, would be difficult to subdue. Jon exhaled. I hope not, but we can't be complacent. Perhaps it's time we reaffirm the readiness of each region's defenses. Not to threaten anyone, but to show that we stand firm. Agreed. The Vale, the Riverlands, the Reach. None have large standing armies these days, but they can raise militia quickly if needed. The only question is whether the realm has the will to fight after so many years of peace. Jon managed a faint smile. We overcame the greatest threat of all, the Night King, and that was after many years of devastating war. Now we have even more reason to stand together. I'd say the will is there if needed. Sansa's eyes shone with quiet pride. I hope you're right. Weeks slipped by, and Tyrion's party continued south along the coast. They sailed from Old Town around the southern tip of Westeros, aiming for Sunspear in Dorne. The delegates from New Guise marveled at the arid cliffs and pale sands that gradually replaced the lush green of the Reach. At last, they disembarked at the harbor near Sunspear's broken old walls. Damaged in the last great wars and never fully rebuilt, as the Dornish had no need for imposing fortresses under the new order. Over the years, they had converted many old ramparts into communal living spaces or marketplaces. A local assembly greeted them. Men and women with sun-kissed skin, wearing light linen clothes. Some wore colored sashes denoting their roles, red for logistics, gold for trade, green for agriculture, blue for water management. There was no prince or princess of Dorne these days, though the people still took pride in their fierce independence. Tyrion acted once more as a mediator, introducing Sadion and his delegates. The conversation mirrored the prior ones in King's Landing and Old Town. Sadion asked to lease a portion of the port for New Guise usage, with extraterritorial laws. The Dornish, after hearing him out, politely but firmly refused. We have local laws that guarantee personal freedom. We do not lease land to foreign powers who want to circumvent them, said a woman named Talia, who led the Trade Council. But you are free to open shops, hire workers under our rules, pay the established tariffs, and abide by local customs. Sadion's frustration boiled over. You call yourselves separate from King's Landing, yet you parrot the same refusal. Is there no region in this land that will think independently and accept our terms? Talia gave him a half-smile. We do think independently. We simply happen to agree on this point. We have no interest in reintroducing oppressive contracts or letting a foreign power carve out enclaves. If that is what you seek, you will not find it here. Is there truly no lord or lady with authority to see reason? Paula asked, exasperated. We can offer you mountains of gold. Talia's face hardened. There is no single figure to bribe. That's the point. Even if you tried, the rest of us would not accept it. A heavy silence. Tyrion folded his arms, meeting Sadion's glare with a neutral expression. You see the pattern. Accept local laws or move on. Sadion slowly rose from his seat. Fine. I see we're at an impasse. We will open modest trade under your constraints, as we did in Old Town, but do not expect us to be satisfied. Our confederacy might reconsider how we approach Westeros in the future. Tyrion caught the veiled threat in his words but remained quiet. That evening, after the day's tense meetings, Tyrion found himself sitting on a balcony of the old castle keep in Sunspear. The keep was half converted into a communal lodging for visitors, with large open terraces that overlooked the sea. He gazed at the horizon, where the sun was dipping below the water, painting the waves in brilliant orange. The warm Dornish air carried the scent of salt and desert flowers. He felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Sadion approach, wearing a lighter robe than usual, presumably to cope with the desert heat. The Confederates studied Tyrion with an unreadable expression, then stepped up beside him to watch the sunset. For a while, neither spoke. Then Sadion said quietly, "You are a clever man, Tyrion Lannister. You have traveled with us for weeks, ensuring we do not strike secret bargains. You must be quite loyal to your realm." Tyrion gave a little shrug. "I am loyal to the idea that we can avoid the mistakes of the past. Westeros is better off without foreign enclaves or a return to oppressive systems. You and I both know that your labor contracts are but a euphemism for slavery. Even if somewhat gentler than the old days, it would poison our land." Sadion's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. The Confederacy's wealth depends on controlling labor. If we cannot establish that system here, perhaps we should move on. "Perhaps you should," Tyrion agreed softly. Then he sighed. "In truth, we want trade. We want knowledge. We have no desire for isolation, but not at the cost of letting your laws override ours in pockets of our land." Sadion studied him. "And if our confederacy decides to force the issue with ships and swords? Do you think your precious counsels can stand against a professional army?" Tyrion's eyes flicked sideways. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do, because ours would be an entire realm united, not an assembly of petty lords. Every region would rise. We have done so before, against far greater threats." Sadion gave a low chuckle. "You speak with unwavering confidence for a land that let go of monarchy. Some might call that a recipe for weakness." Tyrion turned to look at him fully, the orange light illuminating the lines on his face. "Strangely enough, it's been a recipe for unity. You can't exploit one faction without dealing with all. You can't bribe or intimidate a single point of power. And we have no illusions about a grand dynasty to protect. We only protect each other." He let a silent stretch, then added, "If you come at us with war, you'll find yourselves facing not a fractious continent, but a people who remember how to stand against a foe that threatened all life. Good luck." The finality in his tone made Sadion swallow his retort. After a moment, the Confederate nodded stiffly, as if acknowledging Tyrion's point, then turned away. "We leave in 3 days," he said. "I suspect we will not find much else in Dorne. Then we'll return across the sea, bearing our disappointment." Tyrion offered no farewell as Sadion departed, footsteps echoing in the warm evening. Only after the tall man's figure disappeared did Tyrion release the tension in his shoulders. A hush fell over the balcony, broken only by the distant sound of Dornish music drifting from a nearby courtyard. Tyrion leaned on the stone rail, watching the last gleams of daylight sink beneath the horizon. In another life, he might have found all this political wrangling tiresome, but he was oddly content. He was helping preserve a realm that, for all its quirks, felt more just and stable than any he had known before. No single tyrant, no unstoppable feuds, no hidden blades behind every tapestry, at least not in the ways of old. True to Sadion's word, the Confederate envoys departed a few days later, boarding their ships in Sunspear's harbor. Tyrion, satisfied that they could do no more mischief, decided to remain in Dorne for a time, visiting the local councils and ensuring lines of communication with King's Landing stayed strong. He wrote frequent letters to Brienne and Bran, updating them on the final departure of the delegates. The gist: the Confederacy had failed to secure enclaves, but had opened small trade offices under local laws. They left with frustrated hearts, but no immediate sign of war. Soon after, the first trickle of Eastern trade goods began to appear in Westeros's markets, legitimately under the new agreements. Spices, carved ivory figurines, exotic dyes. The items were expensive, but it was honest commerce. Some folks in King's Landing marveled at the bright colors and pungent flavors. The merchants of New Guise made decent coin, but not the windfall they might have hoped for under exclusive deals. All the while, rumors floated that the Confederates might return with a larger mission, or that they might carry back unflattering tales of Westeros's refusal to bow to any foreign system. But as the weeks turned to months, no armada appeared on the horizon. No declaration of war arrived. It seemed that, for now, New Guise had decided to bide its time or focus elsewhere. Perhaps they had concluded that Westeros was not so easily manipulated. The realm breathed a collective sigh of relief. People turned back to the everyday tasks of preparing for winter, harvesting grain, preserving foods, building up communal reserves. They felt secure in the knowledge that their land, shaped by forgetting and partial remembering, had proven resilient against an external test. And no single shot had been fired. Winter fell softly across the north, bringing gentle snows to Winterfell's courtyards. Jon oversaw the distribution of blankets and provisions to far-flung villages. The free folk beyond the wall, in collaboration with the northerners, reported that the straggling whites were fewer than ever, possibly on the verge of extinction. The Watchers occasionally destroyed small groups, but the threat of another long night seemed remote. Jon felt a subdued joy at that news, recalling the days when the dead threatened everything. Now that horror receded into memory. Sansa helped organize a new schooling system for children in Winterfell and the surrounding hamlets, drawing on the realm's shared knowledge initiatives. Each settlement had a small hall where traveling scholars or local tutors taught reading, basic history, and other practical skills. Families took turns hosting them, ensuring that children and even adults could learn. It was a far cry from the old days, when only nobles had access to maesters. Late one evening, when snow dusted the courtyard, Jon and Sansa stood atop the walls of Winterfell, wrapped in heavy cloaks. They looked out over the dark expanse of fields, the moonlight glinting on the fresh snow. Their breath mingled in the frosty air. Behind them, lanterns flickered in arrow slits, revealing the warmth of the great keep's halls. Jon broke the silence first. "Hard to believe how different this place is," he said quietly. "The last time we faced winter, it came with an army of the dead on its heels." Sansa nodded, a trace of old pain in her eyes. "This time, the biggest concern is whether we'll have enough fodder for the cattle, or if the smaller villages have enough salted fish. It's a relief, though I suppose it feels almost anticlimactic." Jon glanced at her. "Do you miss the old days? The excitement, the sense of, I don't know, living on the brink?" She shook her head emphatically. "I don't miss the terror, or the betrayals, or the cruelty. I'm grateful we have a chance to build normal lives." "You?" Jon exhaled a slow breath. "I feel restless sometimes, but maybe that's just me. I used to define myself by war. Now I define myself by service, I suppose, helping the North stay stable." He paused, then added with a crooked smile, "There's a certain peace in that." She reached out and squeezed his gloved hand. "You deserve peace, Jon. We all do." They stood quietly for a while, gazing at the moonlit plains. A gentle hush settled over them, broken only by the soft whistle of wind. Sansa's thoughts drifted to the rest of their family. Bran, far away, guiding the realm in his mysterious way. Arya, wandering the seas, occasionally sending letters from far-flung coasts. Rickon, gone so young, along with their parents. Memories long since integrated into her daily reflections. She felt sorrow for what was lost, but also gratitude for what they'd rebuilt. In time, they turned from the wall and descended into the keep, heading for the warmth of the hearth. Winter was gentle this year, and so was life, for once. In King's Landing, Brienne continued her watchful duties by Bran's side. Over the winter months, the city's population remained stable. Workshops produced new goods, fabrics, pottery, metal tools. A slow but steady commerce with bravos, pentos, and now new guys supplemented local resources. Each transaction adhered to the realm's guiding principle. Foreigners must abide by local laws, ensuring no exploitation or enclaves. Bran was often seen in the Godswood, or sometimes rolling through the city streets, observing daily life. He listened to petitioners who came asking for help resolving unusual disputes, like a fisher who discovered a hidden tunnel to a noble's old wine cellar, or a scholar who found a chest of old Targaryen gold. In these odd cases, local councils sometimes sought Bran's counsel, especially if the question touched on the old laws. He always gave measured, calm suggestions, grounded in fairness. He never tried to decree a final judgment. Instead, he guided them to find their own consensus. The people, who remembered or had learned that he had once erased the realm's memories to save them from endless war, respected him deeply. Some found him almost superhuman. Others saw him as a wise but distant caretaker. Either way, his presence ensured a sense of continuity, a living link between the old nightmares and the new hope. On one particularly cold morning, a messenger arrived from the Stormlands with word of a battered ship that had washed ashore near Shipbreaker Bay. The sailors on board claimed to hail from Slaver's Bay, or what was once Slaver's Bay. Someone heard them mention Marine Yunkai. They were half-starved and fearful, bearing rumors of new conflicts across the sea. Brienne took the report to Bran, who listened with mild concern. "If conflict is brewing in Essos," Bran said softly, "it could spill over here. That might explain the Confederacy's push to secure enclaves. Perhaps they're looking for safe harbors should their wars at home intensify." He gazed at Brienne. "Keep listening for more. If large waves of refugees come, we must be ready." Brienne nodded. "I'll coordinate with the city's councils to store extra provisions. We can house some, but if entire fleets arrive, we need a plan across multiple ports." "Yes," Bran agreed. Deep winter settled over the land, though it was mild in the south. In the shivering sea off the eastern coast, storms raged, occasionally driving foreign vessels to Westeros's shores. Some ships bore refugees from distant conflicts, others merchants, others pirates seeking to test the realm's defenses. Yet the decentralized but united port towns either welcomed peaceful traders or captured pirates with swift communal action. Word spread that Westeros was not easy prey. In Bravos, rumor had it that bankers were curious about investing in Westeros's new order, perhaps establishing a branch in White Harbor or King's Landing. They recognized that a realm with stable councils and broad-based production might be a reliable partner. Meanwhile, Volantis was said to be embroiled in a power struggle, some factions wanting to restore slavery in full, others trying to adopt new systems. The outcome could shape the entire lower reaches of Essos. Westeros heard these tales from sailors, but they did not fear entanglement so long as they stood firm. Weeks passed, turning to months. The realm turned quietly, people living their lives in a peace most never thought possible. The troubles from Essos felt distant, overshadowed by local concerns, harvests, winter storms, the slow building of new roads, the exchange of knowledge from the Citadel. Bran occasionally reached out through the weirwoods, ensuring no other major threat brewed in the corners of Westeros. One morning, with the first signs of spring thaw approaching, Brienne found Bran alone in the Godswood once again, eyes half-lidded in that familiar posture of introspection. She knew the subtle signals of his green seeing. She waited patiently until he opened his eyes. "Apologies, my lord." She stopped herself. That old habit again. "Apologies, Bran. I didn't wish to disturb you, but we have new arrivals at the gate. They say they come from across the sea, claiming to be envoys not of New Guys, but of a different alliance, one calling itself the Triarchy of the Red Waves. They're demanding an audience." Bran let out a quiet breath, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It never ends, does it?" Brienne's lips twitched. "Apparently not. I recall from my fuller memory that a Triarchy once threatened the Stepstones in Daemon Targaryen's time, centuries ago. Perhaps it's a new iteration. Should I gather the council?" "Yes." Bran turned his head, the gentle breeze stirring his hair. "Let us see if these newcomers have learned anything from the Confederates' attempts, or if they, too, come seeking enclaves or subjugation." Brienne offered a half-bow. "As you will." She moved away, leaving Bran in the hush. A sense of calm certainty settled over him. If these new envoys hoped to exploit old feuds, they would find none. If they came seeking to sow discord, they would face a realm that had chosen unity over monarchy, and memory tempered by the knowledge of the old world's mistakes. In their amnesia, Westeros had discovered a deeper resilience, one that might stand against the storms of foreign ambition. Bran touched the bark of the weirwood, feeling the heartbeat of the land. He sensed no fear, only a gentle, resolute will. The realm was at peace, and though challenges from beyond would continue to arise, Westeros would meet them hand in hand, refusing to be dragged back into the old cycles of war. Yes, Bran thought, letting his eyes drift shut once more. They were truly free. Free from the shackles of memory gone rancid. Free to learn from the past without living in its shadow. And if the wide world beyond their shores still churned with the ambitions of slavers, conquerors, and power-seekers, Westeros had at last learned how to stand firm against such threats. Together, they would move forward, city by city, council by council, memory by memory, lighting the path toward a future that need not repeat. The old cruelties. Spring was coming, and with it life,